I only needed somewhere safe to sleep. Then that silent horn began revealing its past.
She was 21 and broke. No apartment, no left side hearing, no name anyone in music would answer. Just a cracked leather trumpet case and $9 she had kept folded in a bus station Bible. And with that $9, she bought a drowned brass horn repair shop beneath an abandoned jazz club on South Rampart Street in Orleans Parish, Louisiana, where the place fell off working maps in 1978. The cellar door had swollen shut from floodwater. Black mold flowered along the brass-stained ceiling joists. The county had condemned it since 2005 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the sealed bell throat of a giant sousaphone hanging above the workbench, in a sodded compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Mae Broussard had been listening her whole life without knowing it. Not listening in the ordinary way, with both ears taking in the world evenly, the way rain comes down on a tin roof and seems to touch every rib of the house at once. Sadie listened slantwise. She learned early that sound could arrive broken, that voices could slip away on her left side like a minnow's under muddy water, and that a person could be present in a room and still miss the sentence that changed everything. She was born in a narrow rented house outside Opelousas, Louisiana, where the window screens held the dust of cane roads and every supper smelled faintly of onions, grease, and damp wood. Her mother, Lorraine, worked the counter at a pharmacy where she smiled so steadily that strangers believed she was content. Her father, Earl Broussard, played second cornet in weekend dance bands and fixed farm radios when the season was slow. He had long fingers, stained nails, and a habit of tapping valve patterns against his thigh while waiting for coffee to boil. Before Sadie could spell her own name, she knew the difference between a trumpet played with pride and one played for rent money. Pride had patience in it. Rent money hurried. Earl would come home after midnight smelling of tobacco smoke and horn oil, and he would set his cornet on the kitchen table as if it were a sleeping child. Then he would lift Sadie into his lap and press the cool mouthpiece into her palm. "Brass keeps what hands teach it," he would say. She did not understand him then, but she liked the weight of the instrument, the way it seemed both sturdy and tender, as if it had travelled through too many rooms to be careless with anyone's breath. Earl died when Sadie was 8, not in a dramatic way, not with music swelling around him, but on a wet Wednesday afternoon after his truck slid on Highway 190 and struck a culvert hard enough to fold the front axle under. The parish deputy brought his cornet home in a brown paper grocery sack because the case had split open. Lorraine took the sack without crying. She placed it in the hall closet, closed the door, and went to stir a pot of red beans that had already gone thick at the bottom. After that, silence entered the house by habit. Lorraine remarried 3 years later. The man's name was Vernon Pike, and he wore pressed short-sleeved shirts no matter the weather, with a pen clipped squarely in the pocket and a silver watch that he polished with the edge of his handkerchief. He sold insurance from a storefront office beside a tire shop, and spoke of risk the way some men speak of scripture. He believed in neat rooms, quiet meals, closed curtains, and children who made themselves useful without being asked. He did not beat the walls or raise a hand. He did not need to. His displeasure had a slow temperature. It cooled a room until everyone inside it began moving carefully. Sadie learned to set cups down without sound. She learned to stop humming before she knew she had begun. She learned that her mother's eyes could pass over her with tenderness hidden so deep it might as well have been absence. When Vernon spoke, Lorraine's hands became busy at once. She wiped clean counters already clean. She folded towels into thirds. She pressed her lips together, not sharply, but in a tired line, as though speech itself had grown expensive. Only on Saturdays did Sadie feel the world loosen. Her father's older sister, Aunt Bernice Broussard, lived in a weathered shotgun house off Pinhook Road in Lafayette, behind a closed accordion repair storefront whose painted sign had faded to the color of weak tea. Bernice had been a brass finisher once, the only woman in a backroom shop that repaired band instruments for schools from Lake Charles to Baton Rouge. She was small, wiry, and exact, with white hair pinned flat against her head and forearms marked by a dozen pale burns from hot solder. Every Saturday morning, if Vernon was in a charitable mood or too occupied to object, Sadie took the first bus west and walked 6 blocks from the stop to Bernice's house. The workshop sat behind the kitchen, a lean-to room with 2 windows, 1 vise, 3 lamps and wooden drawers labelled in Bernice's careful block lettering. Valve springs, corks, felt pads, ferrules, braces, water keys, pearl buttons, scrap brass. Nothing in that room was ornamental. Everything had a place, and every place had earned its purpose. Bernice taught without softness, but never without care. She showed Sadie how to cradle a trumpet body so the tubing did not talk under pressure. She taught her to warm a joint until solder shone, not until it ran wild. She set dents with magnetic balls and steel rods, rolling the brass from within until the wound rose toward its original curve. She had Sadie polish tarnish with rouge cloth in circles so small they seemed foolish, until by afternoon the bell began to hold light again. When Sadie made a careless movement, Bernice would place 1 dry finger on the bench and wait. She did not scold quickly. Again, she would say. So Sadie did it again. On those Saturdays the house smelled of coffee, flux, beeswax, valve oil, and the dusty sweetness of cane syrup biscuits. Bernice warmed in a skillet. At noon they ate standing up, because Bernice said sitting too long made grief believe it had been invited. In the afternoons, Bernice opened instrument cases brought by band directors and church musicians, each one carrying its own private weather, a trombone slide bent from a parade fall, a baritone horn dark with closet years, a cornet from a Baptist church whose 3rd valve stuck whenever the choir reached the final refrain. Sadie loved the cases most of all. Before they opened, she loved not knowing what was inside and knowing, at the same time, that someone had trusted Bernice to return it whole. By 13, Sadie could replace valve pads with a steady hand. By 14, she could lap a piston until it moved like a wet seed between finger and thumb. By 15, she could hear when a trumpet had been dropped by the way the 2nd valve casing answered a fingernail tap. Her right ear sharpened itself around loss before the loss had fully come. She heard differences other people ignored, a flatness beneath a bright note, a rattle under lacquer, the faint dull click of a brace gone loose. Bernice noticed. One evening in late August, after rain had shut itself against the windows and the lamps made gold circles on the bench, Bernice handed Sadie a badly crushed flugelhorn bell from a college player in Crowley. The bell looked beyond saving. Its rim had folded in, and one side was puckered where the brass had stretched thin. Sadie stared at it a long while. Bernice set down her coffee. "Do not force roundness on a thing too soon," she said. "Coax the memory back." That was the sentence Sadie carried longest. It meant brass remembered shape. It meant pressure had to be honest, exact, and patient. It meant the worst dents were not repaired by striking hard from outside, but by finding the hidden curve and helping it rise. Years later, when Sadie had almost nothing left that could be called inheritance, she would still have that sentence kept like a match in a dry tin. Bernice died in November of Sadie's 17th year. 3 days after a cold front moved through Lafayette and left frost silvering the roofs of parked cars. It was a small stroke, the doctor said, though there was nothing small about the absence she left in the workshop. Sadie arrived after the funeral to find Vernon already there with a cardboard box and a man from an estate resale place. Lorraine stood in the kitchen holding Bernice's apron against her chest. The drawers had been opened. The rods, dent balls, rawhide mallets, burnishers, mandrels and mouthpiece pullers were spread across the bench in unchosen piles. Bernice's ledger books were stacked beside a lamp. Her best torch was gone. "She owed," Vernon said, without looking at Sadie. "Everybody owes somebody." The estate man picked up a dent rod, turned it over once, and laid it in his box with no more feeling than if it were a curtain bracket. Sadie stepped toward the bench, but Lorraine touched her sleeve, not to restrain her strongly, only enough. That was worse. By sunset, the shop had been emptied of everything that could be sold quickly. Sadie saved one cracked rouge cloth from the trash, one green felt valve pad stuck to the underside of a drawer, and Bernice's pencil worn nearly to the ferrule, which had rolled beneath the workbench where no one bothered to look. The rest of the trade went away in the back of a van, rattling over potholes. After Bernice's death, Sadie went into music because she could not bear to go anywhere else. She played trumpet at church revivals, weddings, casino lounges, funeral processions, French Quarter brunch rooms where tourists clapped on the wrong beat, and hotel bars where the carpet smelled of spilled beer. No amount of cleaning could forgive. She played cleanly with restraint. She could not afford flamboyance. She wrote melodies late at night on napkins and receipt backs, then copied them into a spiral notebook she kept under her mattress. At 19, she met Gavin Rusk, a band manager with a narrow beard, soft shoes, and the kind of politeness that arrived before him like cologne. He handled a rotating brass band that played private parties, riverfront festivals, and out-of-state events where the contracts came stapled and difficult to read. Gavin praised Sadie's writing in a lowered voice, as though he were protecting it from lesser ears. "You have a kept sound," he told her, after a rehearsal on Magazine Street. People pay for that. No one had ever said her music could earn more than tips folded damp from someone's palm. Gavin brought papers. He explained them while other musicians packed cases around her. He placed his finger under the lines she should sign and skipped the paragraphs where ownership changed hands. She was hungry that week and behind on rent. Her mother had stopped answering calls unless Vernon was out of the house. Sadie signed. For a little while, work came steadily. Her melodies moved through hotel ballrooms and wedding tents under other titles. Gavin introduced her as a utility player. He called her dependable, he called her reserved. He did not call her composer. When checks arrived, he subtracted fees no one had named before and told her she was fortunate to be included. Then came the night at a club near Chupitula's, where a speaker blew during the second set and sent a white crack of sound through the stage monitors. Sadie had been standing close, turned slightly to cue the trombone line. Pain opened in her left ear with such clean brightness that she lost the next 4 measures. She finished the set because musicians are taught to finish what they begin, even when the room tilts and the air tastes of pennies. By morning the hearing on that side had retreated behind a wall. The clinic doctor used words like inner ear trauma, partial loss, uncertainty. Gavin used different words: liability, weakness, difficult. He stopped calling within a week. By the end of the month he had told 3 band leaders she was unreliable under pressure and had been drinking before sets. Sadie heard this from a drummer who would not meet her eyes while saying it. Her work thinned, then emptied. She tried restaurants first, then housekeeping, then a laundry service that fired her after she missed instructions called from her left. She sold her trumpet, then her black dress shoes, then the silver mouthpiece her father had once played, wrapped in flannel at the back of her drawer. For 3 days after selling it, she could not eat anything with salt. Vernon allowed her back into the Opelousas' house for 6 months because Lorraine asked in a voice so low, Sadie barely caught the words. He set conditions with the calm of a man arranging furniture. No music after 6, no visitors, no missed rent, no complaints about chores. Sadie slept in the enclosed porch where the winter damp pressed through the boards and the washer pipes knocked at night, like someone trying to be let in. She kept Bernice's pencil in a jelly jar beside the cot. The eviction came on March 18, 2020, after a morning rain that left the yard shining and the porch steps dark. Sadie had gone to the grocery for Lorraine with 3 coupons folded in her pocket. When she returned, her belongings were on the porch in 2 trash bags and 1 cardboard fruit crate. Her jacket lay over the crate. Her spiral notebook, the one with the melodies, had swollen at one corner from the wet boards. Vernon stood inside the screen door, not touching it. "You cannot stay in this house after morning." 8 words. He said them evenly. Lorraine stood behind him with a dish towel in both hands. She did not look at the bags. She did not look at the notebook. Her hair was clipped back poorly, with one strand stuck to her cheek, and Sadie noticed, with a clarity that felt almost gentle, that her mother had been crying before Sadie came home. Yet Lorraine's feet did not move. She held the towel and watched the rainwater gather along the porch groove nearest Sadie's shoe. Sadie waited for one sentence. Any sentence. None came. So she bent down, lifted the fruit crate first, and tucked the wet notebook under her arm. The grocery bag remained at the door with milk, rice, and the discounted pork chops Lorraine had asked for. Vernon opened the screen only wide enough to bring it in. Sadie walked to the bus stop with the trash bags cutting red half-moons into her fingers. A passing truck sprayed water up her skirt. She did not turn around. Behind her, the house settled back into itself. Curtains still, porch empty. The grocery receipt dissolving in her pocket. For 6 weeks she lived in the geography of people passing through. The first night was Lafayette, on a bench inside the Greyhound station until the guard told her benches were for ticketed passengers only. She bought the cheapest ticket she could afford, not because she had a destination, but because paper permission was still permission. In Lake Charles she slept upright under fluorescent lights with her trumpet case against her knees. Though by then the case held only clothes, the rouge cloth, Bernice's pencil, and the spiral notebook wrapped in a plastic grocery sack. She learned which stations locked bathrooms after midnight and which attendants looked away if a person washed carefully at the sink. She learned that bus heat dries socks stiff. She learned that vending machine crackers taste different when counted as supper. She learned to keep her hearing side toward the room and her bad side against a wall. From Lake Charles she went east to Baton Rouge, where she spent 2 nights beneath the overhang of the old state capitol grounds, waking each time footsteps changed rhythm near her. Then to Hammond, where a Baptist woman named Mrs. Talley gave her a boiled egg and half a satsuma from a paper lunch sack after noticing the way Sadie watched steam rise from a diner vent. Then to Slidell, where rain came sideways and soaked through the trash bags until her spare blouse smelled of mildew. Her money went down in exact amounts because there was comfort in arithmetic. $4.78 after Lafayette, $3.09 after crackers and a laundromat dryer. She did not run long enough. $2 even after the Hammond ticket. $1.34 after coffee bought mostly so she could sit indoors for 20 minutes. 56 cents after a woman at the Slidell station let her add coins to a fare and ride south on a church voucher that was not meant for her. By the time she reached New Orleans, the city was already warm with late April damp. It rose around her in smells she had known all her life and never trusted completely. River mud, frying oil, diesel jasmine, wet brick, spilled beer, old wood, and something metallic under it all, like coins held too long in the mouth. She slept first behind a bus shelter on Loyola Avenue, then in the corner of a hospital waiting room until a nurse with tired eyes touched her shoulder and told her she could not remain there. On the 3rd week she found the public library on Loyola and became a person who belonged nowhere but could sit under a roof among dictionaries. Libraries had their own mercy. Nobody asked why a person read the classifieds for 2 hours. Nobody minded if she turned pages slowly or held a newspaper close because one ear could not gather the room. Sadie washed her hands in the restroom and dried them under warm air until the chapped skin stopped stinging. Then she sat at a table near the Louisiana history shelves and opened the municipal surplus notices because they were free to read and written in a language of abandonment. Most listings were too large, too legal, or too ruined even for imagining. Flooded warehouse parcels, tax-defaulted lots, fire-damaged doubles with no roof, storage units sold in bulk. Instruments occasionally appeared, but never at prices meant for someone with coins. Then, near the bottom of a page folded wrong by the last reader, she saw the notice. Orleans Parish Surplus Liquidation, Subgrade Commercial Unit, formerly registered as Bell and Reed Brass Repair, beneath defunct Magnolia Crescent Jazz Club, South Rampart Corridor. Water intrusion, structural uncertainty, no warranty, buyer assumes all remediation and removal obligations. Minimum bid, $9 deed transfer administrative only, condemned structure subject to demolition review. The words did not invite hope. They were colder than that. Bell Reed Brass Repair. Sadie read the line 3 times, moving her finger beneath each word. Brass repair. Subgrade. Water intrusion. No warranty. $9. She had $9 only because of the bus station Bible, because in the back cover of it she had once tucked a $5 bill from a funeral procession tip and 4 singles from a wedding where the bride's grandmother had asked for just a closer walk with thee. She had forgotten the bills for months, or maybe she had not forgotten, maybe some part of her had kept them away from hunger, because hunger spends everything it can reach. At the library desk, she asked the reference librarian where a person went to place a bid on municipal surplus. The librarian, a man with silver eyebrows and a cardigan too heavy for the season, wrote the address on a square of scrap paper. He did not ask why. He placed the paper in front of her and slid over a transit map with one finger. You will want to go before noon, he said. Those offices close themselves before they close. Sadie thanked him. Her voice came out rough from disuse. Outside New Orleans held the heat close to its buildings. A streetcar bell sounded far away, bright and incomplete in her damaged hearing. She stood on the library steps with the scrap paper in one hand and the cracked trumpet case in the other. People moved around her carrying lunches, briefcases, flowers, plastic bags, children errands. Every one of them seemed attached to a next place. $9 was not a plan. $9 was a door with rot in it. $9 was a flooded cellar under a condemned club, black mold on joists, county language sharp enough to cut a careful hand. $9 was the kind of foolishness Vernon would have folded into a sermon and Gavin would have laughed about over drinks. $9 could have bought crackers, coffee, 1 more hour indoors, 1 more small delay before sleeping under the open weather again. Sadie opened the Bible there on the library steps. The bills were still inside, flattened against the back cover, soft from age and handling. She took them out one by one. The 4 ones. No more, no less. Then she folded the transit map, placed Bernice's pencil in the spine of her notebook, and began walking toward the parish office with the careful, deliberate gait of someone carrying the last sound of a vanished workshop in her hands. By noon, the $9 would be gone. By nightfall, she would own a place the city had already condemned. And beneath the drowned floor of that forgotten brass shop, something sealed in silence had been waiting longer than Sadie had been alive. The bus left New Orleans before sunrise with its windows filmed in grey and its aisles smelling of damp coats, diesel, and sweet coffee gone lukewarm in paper cups. Sadie sat 3 rows from the back with the trumpet case pressed between her knees, though it held no trumpet now, only the last pieces of herself that could be carried without a box. Outside the glass, the city passed in strips, a shuttered tire shop, a church with blue floodlights still burning at the base of a white cross, a man rinsing the sidewalk in front of a corner store before the sun had climbed above the roofline. Then the bus found the highway, and New Orleans flattened behind her into bridge railings, marsh grass, and the wet-breathing country between parish lines. She kept her good ear toward the driver's announcements and her other side against the window, where vibrations stood in for sound. Her ticket carried her only part way. The surplus clerk had told her in a voice as dry as ledger paper that the transfer office for the condemned unit was not in the city proper, but at a parish satellite building west of the lake, where records had been moved after storm damage and never moved back. It was one of those arrangements that made sense to officials and nobody else. The bus dropped her at a crossroads outside La Place just after noon. Heat had already begun to rise from the asphalt, though April had not yet become summer. A thin wind moved through the drainage ditch, carrying the smell of river mud and cut grass. Sadie stood beside the road and looked at the map the librarian had given her, with its blue lines and transfer marks, and understood that she had misread the distance between the last stop and the county office. 7 miles. She shifted the case to her right hand and began walking. The road was not made for walkers. Gravel gathered along the shoulder in loose pale drifts, and each time a truck passed, dust lifted and coated her ankles. She walked past a locked bait shop, a white cinder block church, a fenced lot of rusting equipment, and a row of pecan trees whose leaves had not yet thickened enough to give real shade. Once a woman in a green pickup slowed and asked if she needed a ride, but Sadie shook her head before hearing the whole sentence, because taking help had grown complicated in her. The woman waited a moment, then drove on. By late afternoon the soles of Sadie's shoes had warmed through. Blisters opened under both heels. She stopped once beside a culvert and drank from the bathroom tap of a gas station that would not let her sit. In the mirror above the sink she saw a narrow face under hair pinned badly with 2 bobby pins, a sunburn beginning along her nose, and eyes made watchful by too many public rooms. She washed dust from her hands and dried them on her skirt. The office had closed by the time she reached it. A printed sign on the door gave the hours in black block letters behind the glass. The waiting room chairs sat in deliberate rows, and the counterbell rested in a square of late light. Sadie stood there with her hand on the locked door until the heat went out of the metal. Then she turned away and walked back along the road because a closed office was not a place to sleep beside. The first night after she became a buyer of condemned property, she slept in a hay barn 2 miles beyond the parish building, with permission from no one and apology to everything. She found it after dusk, a low tin-roofed structure set back from the road behind a field that smelled of damp earth and old stalks. The door hung partly open. Inside were square bales stacked to the rafters, a broken rake, feed sacks folded against a wall, and a pair of swallows trapped briefly in the upper darkness before they found their way out through a gap under the eaves. At midnight, the temperature fell to 53 degrees. Sadie knew because she saw it later on a bank sign down the road, and the number seemed to belong to the ache in her knees. She slept on the floor between hay bales with her jacket over her chest and the trumpet case under one arm. Mice moved somewhere in the walls. Rain began after 2 in the morning, light at first, then steady enough to rattle the tin roof with a patient finger-tapping that reminded her of her father's valve patterns, though she did not let the memory settle. She had learned there were recollections that could keep a person warm and others that only took more heat away. Before dawn she rose, brushed hay from her skirt, and walked back toward the office through a world rinsed clean and shining. Her socks were damp, her heels had stiffened around the blisters. A school bus passed in the opposite lane, filled with children leaning into mourning, and one girl near the back lifted her hand. Sadie lifted hers in answer, slowly, after the bus had nearly gone. The parish satellite office sat beside a drainage canal and a squat brick post office. Across from a strip of businesses that looked as if they had survived by lowering their expectations, there was Landry's feed seed with a hand-painted rooster on the window, a coin laundry called Wash and Go where 2 dryers turned behind fogged glass, Melanchontax Notary whose Venetian blinds were bent in the centre, St. Agnes Thrift with Easter dresses hanging in the front window though Easter had passed, and Delphine's Café, a narrow place with a blue awning, where the smell of chicory coffee came out each time the door opened. Sadie noticed each business because she was trying not to notice hunger. The office door unlocked at 8:30. She was waiting on the step when a woman in a navy skirt and soft-soled shoes arrived, carrying a ring of keys, a canvas lunch bag, and a stack of file folders held against her chest. She paused when she saw Sadie, taking in the dust on her shoes, the case, the swollen hands, the face turned a little to the right so sound would enter cleanly. "You here for records," the woman said. "Not unkindly. Or trouble." "Surplus transfer," Sadie answered. The woman looked at her for one more careful second. Then she unlocked the door. Inside, the clerk's office was cooler than the morning and smelled of paper, floor wax, toner, and the faint mineral odour that comes from buildings built low near water. A ceiling fan turned without conviction. On the wall hung framed maps of Orleans Parish and surrounding districts, some fresh, some faded from years of fluorescent light. There were 3 public chairs, a metal counter with a pass-through slot, and behind it, tall shelves loaded with deed books, storage boxes, binders, and manila envelopes tied with red string. The woman set her folders down behind the counter and placed a plastic nameplate at the edge of her desk, turning it square with 2 fingers. MRS. Elaine Carver. Parish Records and Surplus Properties. She was somewhere past 60, with brown skin lined finely at the corners of the mouth, grey hair braided close to her scalp, and reading glasses hanging on a beaded chain of blue and white glass. Her hands were broad, capable and exact in their movements. She did not waste motion. When she sat, she did not sink into the chair. She arrived there. Sadie remained standing until Mrs. Carver pointed at the closest chair. "You can set that case down, child. It will not run." Sadie set it beside her feet but kept one hand on the handle. "Mrs." Carver opened a ledger, then a newer computer file, then a drawer where paper forms lay clipped in yellow bundles. "Which property?" Sadie unfolded the notice. Its creases gone soft from being carried. "Mrs." Carver read the line once. Her face did not change quickly. It settled instead, like dust after a door closes. "That unit, yes." "Ma'am." "You understand it is below grade?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand the club above it has been closed for years?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand there was floodwater in that basement?" "Not seepage." "Floodwater." "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand the city has already marked the structure for review and may order removal if no remediation plan is filed?" "Yes." "Ma'am." "You understand there is no warranty, no inspection, no return of funds, no promise that the stairs will hold, no promise that anything inside belongs to value rather than rot?" Sadie kept her good ear turned toward the counter. "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs." Carver removed her glasses and looked at her without the shield of them. "You understand that people buy these parcels sometimes because they believe a cheap door means a merciful room. It does not always." The words entered Sadie slowly. They were not a refusal. They were the kind of warning a person gives when she has seen enough foolishness to tell it apart from desperation, and enough desperation to know it sometimes deserves one clean signature. "Yes, ma'am," Sadie said. "I understand." "Mrs." Carver put her glasses back on. There were forms. There were more forms after those Sadie signed where indicated, writing her name carefully because the pen skipped on the second page and because the act itself seemed larger than the counter allowed. Mrs. Carver explained the temporary deed, the liability acknowledgement, the demolition review period, the requirement to file proof of secured entry within 10 business days, and the need to remove or board any hazard visible from the street. The stamp came last. It was made of brass and iron, heavier than Sadie expected, with a worn wooden handle darkened by decades of hands. Mrs. Carver fitted the paper under it, pressed down with both palms, and the seal entered the page with a quiet bite. Sadie felt it through the counter more than heard it. A round mark, a parish name, a date, a transfer so modest the world outside did not pause. Mrs. Carver slid a key across the counter. It was tagged with yellow tape. "This may fit the street door." "It may not. If it does not, the lock is your problem now." Sadie nodded. "The entrance is not on Rampart proper. You go behind the old Magnolia Crescent building down the side passage off Perdido, then through the iron gate. Gate is usually chained, but the chain belongs to the club owner's estate, not the parish. If it is open, do not ask me why. If it is closed, call the number on this page, though I would not expect quickness from that office." She drew a map on the back of a scrap form, more useful than the official one, with X marks where alleys narrowed and a note about the back wall with blue tile. Sadie thanked her and stood. That was when Mrs. Carver looked down at the deed again. "Broussard," she said. Sadie's hand tightened around the case handle. "Ma'am." "Mrs." Carver tapped the surname once, lightly, without pointing too hard at a life. I knew a Broussard woman years back, from Lafayette, worked brass, could take a smashed school horn and make the band director believe children were careful creatures. Sadie did not answer. Had a little repair room behind an accordion place, Mrs. Carver continued. Bought valve felts from my brother when he ran supplies through here. Sharp woman. Did not flatter. Paid exact. Sadie's mouth had gone dry. Mrs. Carver watched her long enough to understand. Then her voice changed. Not softer. More careful. She kin to you. My aunt. Gone now. Sadie nodded once. Mrs. Carver opened the drawer again. For a moment Sadie thought there must be another fee. Vone more paper. Like that. Instead, the clerk took out a $1 bill, old and worn, and placed it beneath the tray in her desk without explanation. Then she slid a second paper through the slot. This is the file copy of the condemnation notice. Keep it dry. Bring it back stamped when you file for delay. I do not have anything to stamp it with. You will when you need it, Mrs. Carver said. People find what a place requires after they stop arguing with what it is. Sadie looked at the woman through the opening in the glass. There were many things she could have said then, but they would have been too large for the office and too fragile for mourning. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Carver turned back to her ledger. Go before afternoon rain. The walk into the city took longer than the map promised, because maps are written by people who have slept indoors. Sadie rode one parish bus, then another that smelled of bleach and damp umbrellas, then found herself set down near the edge of the central business district, with the sky lowering over the buildings. She walked the final miles because the transit routes bent away from where she needed to go, or because she no longer trusted anything that required exact change. New Orleans received her without welcome and without surprise. She passed under the expressway where concrete pillars wore old posters in strips. She crossed streets named for men whose statues had already come down or should have. She heard a saxophone somewhere far enough away that her damaged side took it for wind. Along the sidewalks, the city kept its layered hours. Office workers at lunch, a delivery man arguing into a phone, a woman sweeping water from the threshold of a bar not yet open, tourists in pale shoes following one another toward music they had been promised. On Rampart Street, the air changed. It carried old brick heat, gumbo from somewhere unseen, car exhaust, and the faint sour breath of buildings that had held too much water. A dog barked from behind a chain-link fence as Sadie passed, one sharp note repeated until a man's voice called it off. Along the side streets, she saw narrow houses with iron balconies, a boarded social hall, a beauty shop with hand-lettered prices, and a funeral home whose curtains were drawn against the day. The old Magnolia Crescent Jazz Club stood at the corner like a person who had once known how to enter a room. Its upper facade was 3 stories of faded red brick, cracked stucco, and ornamental ironwork rusted into lace at the balcony edges. A crescent moon sign still clung above the main doorway, though the bulbs had been gone for years and pigeons had built inside the hollow letters. The front windows were boarded from within, not neatly, with plywood sheets of different ages and colours. Near the roofline, a painted trumpet, weathered almost away, pointed toward a sky gathering rain. Sadie did not try the front door. She followed Mrs. Carver's map down the side passage where damp brick walls leaned close and the ground dipped toward a drain clogged with leaves, cigarette filters, and black silt. At the far end stood the iron gate. It was chained, but the chain had been cut once and looped back through the bars without a lock. Someone had done it months or years before, then left the metal to rust in place as if abandonment itself were security. Beyond the gate was a rear courtyard no wider than a room. Weeds grew in the cracks. A broken chair lay on its side beside a stack of beer crates gone brittle in the sun. Against the back wall, just as the clerk had drawn, blue tiles formed a low border, some missing, some still shining under grime. The basement entrance sat beneath a short shed roof of corrugated tin. Its door was made of cypress planks swollen at the bottom, banded with black iron straps, and painted a green so dark it had nearly become brown. The key did fit, though reluctantly. Sadie had to lift the door by its handle, turn the key halfway, breathe, then turn again while pushing her shoulder into the wood. The lock gave with a tired internal click. The door opened 2 inches and stopped. She set down the case and worked both hands along the edge. The bottom had stuck to the threshold where flood silt, paint, and rot had made their own seal. She pulled until the skin across her palms burned. Nothing. She braced one foot against the brick and pulled again. This time the door groaned outward, dragging a wet line through the mud hardened beneath it. The smell came first. Not one smell, but layers, each one rising after the other. Standing water long gone foul mould, brass tarnish, rotted paper, rat droppings, old oil, swollen wood, and the mineral cold of a room that had not been warmed by weather or work in years. Sadie stepped back and covered her mouth with her sleeve. Rain began above her, light enough to make the tin roof speak. A stairway descended into blackness. The steps were brick-edged concrete, slick with moss at the sides and coated in a dry powder of silt down the centre. She took out the library pencil, then remembered it was not a tool for testing stairs. From the courtyard she found a broken chair leg and used it instead, pressing each step before trusting her weight. The first held, the second held. The third gave a little at one corner, enough to warn but not fail. Halfway down, daylight thinned. At the bottom her shoes met a floor that answered with a shallow, gritty scrape. She found the switch plate by touch near the stairwell, but flipping it did nothing. Of course it did nothing. She took from her coat pocket the small flashlight a woman at the Baton Rouge station had left beside a sink, and Sadie had carried since, feeling both guilty and grateful. Its beam was weak, yellowed at the edges, but enough. The front room of Bell and Reed brass repair appeared slowly, as if the light were remembering it one object at a time. A customer counter ran along the left wall, its glass display case clouded from within. Behind the glass lay mouthpiece brushes, a corroded lyre clip, 3 cracked reed cases though the shop had not been for reeds, and a row of price cards curled by damp. Repair tickets hung from a wire above the counter, each one furred with mould, names blurred until they belonged to nobody. On the wall behind them were outlines where framed photographs had once hung, cleaner rectangles surrounded by grime. To the right stood 2 chairs for waiting customers. One had collapsed. The other held a fedora turned grey with dust, as if its owner had stepped into another room and been delayed by decades. Near the ceiling, pipes crossed low and sweating. Water had marked the walls in a brown line just above Sadie's knees. The ceiling joists were not high. She could reach them if she lifted her hand. From several hung lengths of cord, hooks and one chain with nothing attached. Mould spread along the boards in dark blooms, and in some places a greenish powder had settled over nails and brackets. The floor was poured concrete, cracked in thin wandering lines. Here and there lay flakes of lacquer, slivers of brass, and small black pellets that made her step carefully. She turned the flashlight toward the back. An open doorway led to the workroom. Sadie crossed the front room, passing the counter with her shoulder turned so she would not brush against the mould-soft tickets. The back room was larger, deeper and colder. A long workbench ran across the far wall beneath a row of small high windows that had been painted shut from the outside. Water stains reached higher here. The bench was blackened in patches from flamework, gouged from tools and bowed slightly in the middle. Above it, pegboards still held ghost outlines where tools had hung, each absence more precise than clutter would have been. But not everything was gone. A vice remained bolted to the bench, its jaws rusted but shut. A dent machine stood in one corner like an iron skeleton. There were bins of scrap brass under a table, green with oxidation, a tub filled with ruined rags, a drawer unit whose lower drawers had swollen past opening. Coils of tubing hung from the wall, some cracked, some whole. Valve casings sat in a coffee can. Bell mandrels lay on a shelf too high for floodwater, dull but not lost. And above the bench, hanging from 2 iron hooks set deep in the joists, was the largest sousaphone Sadie had ever seen. The body circled on itself in a great brass curve, darkened almost brown, its bell turned outward toward the room like an ear too large for any human head. The bell rim had been bent, then hammered partly back. Its throat disappeared into shadow. Solder scars crossed the tubing near the lower bow. Someone had sealed portions of it long ago. Not neatly, but deliberately. A length of wire held the instrument steady against the wall so it would not swing. Sadie lifted the flashlight. Dust lay thick over the bell. A dead moth rested near the rim. The metal did not shine, not even where the beam struck it. Yet there was a shape beneath the tarnish that made her hand rise before she knew it. She did not touch it. Not yet. Rain grew harder outside, tapping on the tin roof above the stair entrance, and then deepening into the city's gutters. Water found some path behind the wall and began ticking into a bucket already, half-rotted at the rim. The room seemed to listen back. Sadie stood in the weak flashlight circle with her wet shoes on condemned concrete, a deed folded inside her jacket, and the city's warning papers in her case. She had nowhere else to go before dark. The first task was the door. Mrs. Carver had said proof of secured entry, and even if no official came quickly, a door that did not close invited more than rain. Sadie climbed back to the courtyard and dragged the broken chair inside, then searched the front room until she found a warped length of shelving behind the counter. With both hands she wedged it under the stair door from inside, so the swollen bottom pressed into the threshold. It would not stop a determined person, but it might persuade a careless one. The second task was a dry place. Dry was not the right word. Less wet, perhaps. She found an area behind the customer counter where the water line had been lower and the ceiling above looked less furred. She swept it with a scrap of cardboard until the worst grit moved aside. From her case, she took the plastic-wrapped notebook, the rouge cloth, the felt pad, the pencil, her spare blouse, one pair of socks, and the bus station Bible. She placed them on the counter, not the floor. Then she sat with her back against the wooden base of the display case and listened. A city basement has many voices after rain. Pipes knock, water travels unseen. Rats test distances, wood swells by increments. Somewhere above, perhaps in the abandoned club, something shifted with a slow scrape that might have been a loose shutter, or might have been a creature larger than Sadie wished to name. She turned her good ear toward each sound until she could separate danger from building, animal from drip, wind from footstep. Her stomach folded on itself. She had not eaten since the boiled egg Mrs. Tally had given her the previous day, unless coffee counted, and coffee did not. In the front room display case she found nothing edible, of course, but in her jacket pocket there remained 3 peppermints from a church vestibule bowl in Hammond. She unwrapped one and let it soften on her tongue slowly, making it last until sweetness became almost food. Night came without ceremony. There was no electricity to mark it, no lamp to switch on, no window low enough to show the changing street. Only the flashlight beam weakening, the stairwell greying, the high windows turning from dirty white to black. Sadie used the last of the light to inspect the stair bottom again. The counter, the distance to the door, the workroom entrance, the sousaphone's hanging hooks, the corners where an animal might shelter. Then she clicked the flashlight off to spare the battery. Darkness filled the basement completely. At first it was a thing to fight. Her damaged ear made the dark uneven, because sound came from wrong directions and distances lost their edges. A drip near the workbench seemed beside her shoulder. A scuttle in the front room seemed behind the wall. A car passing outside entered as a long, dull pressure rather than a noise. She kept one hand on the trumpet case and the other around the cracked leather handle, as though possession could still be argued if someone came. After a while, the dark became less empty. It held the brass smell, it held the cool floor, it held the outline of the counter against her spine and the slow drip into the bucket. It held, above and behind her, the great circular silence of the sousaphone which had once been made to carry bass notes through parades, funerals, dance halls and streets shining after rain. Now it hung in a condemned room, tarnished and sealed, too heavy for display, too particular to discard. Sadie pulled her jacket around her knees. She did not dream at first. She only drifted at the edge of sleep, waking whenever the building spoke too sharply. In one half-dream she was back in the Lafayette workshop, holding a dent rod under a bell, while her aunt's hand guided the angle. In another she was on a stage with no sound coming from her horn, though everyone in the room was dancing anyway. Once she woke with tears cold on her face and did not remember beginning them. Near midnight, a storm drain somewhere in the alley backed up with a wet gulp, and water pushed under the outer door in a thin black line. Sadie watched it cross the floor by feel more than sight, smelling the fresh dirt of it. It stopped 6 feet from her shoes. She waited another 10 minutes, then another, until it did not move closer. Only then did she lie down on her side behind the counter, using the trumpet case as a pillow and the folded blouse beneath her cheek. The concrete took her warmth steadily, her blistered heels pulsed, her left ear rang with its private high tone, the one no one else could hear. Yet beneath it all, deeper than pain, and beyond the ordinary sounds of a wet building, there was another silence in the shop. Not absence. Waiting. Even silence can keep a song. Morning entered through the high-painted windows as a pale stripe above the workbench, too thin to warm anything, but enough to show Sadie where the water had stopped. It had made a dark crescent across the concrete during the night, no wider than a scarf, carrying grit, leaf fragments, and one drowned roach into the low place near the centre drain. The drain itself was capped with rust and silt, useless as a coin pressed into mud. Sadie rose stiffly from behind the counter, her jacket damp at the hem, her cheek marked by the seam of the folded blouse. For a moment she remained still, letting the room arrange itself around her good ear. No footsteps. No voices. Only the city above beginning its day without consulting the basement, and water ticking somewhere behind the far wall. The first 3 days were not days of transformation. They were days of learning how little a body could require and how much a building could demand before breakfast. She found the water first, not inside the shop, but in the courtyard where an exterior spigot protruded from the brick near the blue tile border. It did not work when she turned it. The handle spun with a dry scrape. Later, after following the pipe along the wall and clearing weeds from a shut-off valve near the gate, she managed half a turn with both hands and a piece of chair leg for leverage. Brown water coughed out, then air, then a thin cold stream that smelled like iron but ran clear after 5 minutes. She did not drink at once. She filled a cracked plastic bin she found under the counter, let the sediment settle, and tore a strip from her spare blouse to strain it into a coffee tin. Then she boiled it outside in an old enamel pot balanced over 3 bricks, feeding the tiny fire with splinters from the broken chair because she did not yet trust the chimney and would not burn anything indoors until she knew where smoke wished to go. The bathroom was worse. Behind the workroom, past a warped door that opened with a damp wooden gasp, was a narrow toilet closet with green tile, a sink stained orange beneath the faucet, and a toilet that had not seen mercy in years. There was no flush, no clean line, and no dignity left to the fixture. Sadie opened the little window with a putty knife she found in a drawer and tied a rag over her mouth. For 3 days she used the courtyard after dark and the public library when she could get there. On the 4th morning she would begin cleaning that room because a person cannot restore anything while pretending the body is not part of the work. Before that came the floors. Concrete tells stories differently from wood. It does not creak in warning so much as shift its damp upward, revealing low places through chill and powder. Sadie walked each section barefoot on the 2nd morning because her shoes masked too much. The floor sloped toward the drain, then rose slightly beneath the workbench, where perhaps someone long ago had poured an extra pad for heavy equipment. Near the front counter a crack ran from wall to wall, narrow as thread but deep enough to hold black water in its seam. The stairs had their own language. The first step from the courtyard was solid, the second sounded hollow under the heel, the third crumbled at its left edge, the fourth collected grit in the middle, and would become slippery after rain. The fifth held but shifted with a faint sand sound beneath. Sadie marked the weak edges with chalk from a ruined price card and learned to descend on the right hand against the wall, weight forward, never carrying more than she could drop without losing balance. By the 3rd evening she could cross the front room in darkness without striking her shin on the collapsed chair. She knew the pipe that dripped every 27 seconds, the place near the counter where air moved cold from an unseen gap, the workroom drawer that clicked at night when the swollen wood released a little pressure. She knew which sounds belonged to rats above the ceiling and which belonged to cars passing in the alley. She knew how the great sousaphone made no sound at all. That was the strangest thing. Everything else answered the building. The rusted vise clicked faintly as temperature changed. The drawer handles gave their tiny pings. Tubing on the wall shifted once when a truck rumbled by. But the sousaphone did not stir, though it hung from old hooks and should have answered vibration like any broad metal body. It waited without declaring itself. On the 4th morning, Sadie walked to the strip of businesses near the parish satellite road because Mrs. Carver's warning had become a list in her head. Secure entry, file delay, clean hazards visible from the street, do not die under your own ceiling. She had no money left beyond coins in the lining of her case, and 1 quarter found beneath the display counter, green at the edge but spendable after rubbing. Landry's feed seed stood open, its rooster window freshly washed in streaks. Inside, the store smelled of fertilizer, cedar shavings, galvanized buckets, feed corn, machine oil, and coffee so strong it seemed to have opinions. The aisles were narrow, crowded with practical things: rope, hinges, chicken wire, garden seed, rubber boots, mouse traps, kerosene lantern wicks, blue tarps, nails sold by weight in open bins, brushes hanging from pegboard, and sacks of lime stacked beside the back wall. Behind the counter stood a man with a white beard cut square along his jaw, and a left hand missing half the ring finger. His forearms were thick and freckled. He wore a faded LSU cap, reading glasses low on his nose, and a chambray shirt mended at both elbows with fabric that did not match. When he looked at Sadie's shoes, then at her hands, then at the cracked leather case, he did not ask whether she was lost. "Morning," he said. "Morning. You need feed. Seed, or a thing nobody asks for anymore." Sadie placed Mrs. Carver's condemnation notice on the counter. "Not because he had authority over it, but because paper sometimes explained what a mouth could not. I need to secure a basement door and clear a chimney enough to test it. I need to do both cheaply. The man read the top line, then the address. His eyebrows lifted only once. You bought the Drowned Horn place. Yes, sir. On purpose. Yes, sir. He folded the notice back along its crease. Name's Henry Landry. My father sold coal scuttles to that club when coal was already foolish. Sit if you need to. I can stand. That was not what I asked. But all right. He came around the counter with a yellow legal pad and a pencil tucked behind his ear. Sadie noticed that he moved with a slight limp, not painful exactly, but permanent. He did not speak while he wrote headings: door, chimney, mould, water, light, hands. Under each he began listing items, pausing only to ask what she already had. Money first, Sadie said. Henry looked up. I do not have an account. Most people do not until somebody writes their name down. I cannot promise when I can pay. Can you promise you will not lie about it? Yes, sir. Then we are halfway there. He tore the page from the pad, turned it around, and wrote at the top, Sadie Broussard, Bell Reed. Rampart Basement. Beneath it he drew 2 lines. Phone for credit. Phone for cash. Then he opened a drawer and took out a small booklet with a green cover. Frayed at the spine. Before my wife passed, she collected pamphlets from extension offices because she believed any disaster could be improved by a government diagram. This one is damp buildings, chimneys, and basic masonry. It is old, but water has not changed its mind since printing. He slid it across. Sadie did not touch it at once. Free things had begun to feel dangerous. Henry understood enough not to smile. Manuals no charge. It already survived 1 hurricane and 3 grandchildren. It can go work for you now. I will return it. Return knowledge by using it. He built the first supply list with the exactness of a man who had watched people fail from buying the wrong pound of the right thing. 1 hasp and staple set. Heavy zinc, $2.40. 1 used padlock from a drawer of traded odds, Vone dollar. 16 3-inch exterior screws. Sold loose, 32 cents. 1 screwdriver with a cracked yellow handle. Store loan. No charge. 1 stiff wire chimney brush. 7-inch round. $4 deposit. Deposit postponed. 20 feet of rope. Issel. Vone $1.80. 1 dust mask. 59 cents, though he added a second from an opened box without writing it down. 1 pair of cotton gloves. 75 cents. 1 small bottle of bleach. 48 cents. 1 tin of axle grease for hinges. 60 cents. 1 box of wooden matches. 12 cents. 2 dented cans of beans from the back shelf, marked unsaleable because the labels had torn. No charge after Henry frowned at them as if they had offended him. You will want a lantern, he said. I cannot. You will want one anyway. He reached beneath the counter and lifted out a kerosene lantern with a bent handle. It's chimney-cracked but usable if kept upright. This was my brother's. He borrowed it from me in 1986 and returned it in 1999 with no apology. I have been waiting to be rid of it. Sadie touched the metal handle with 2 fingers. I do not know when I can pay. You already said that. Repeating it does not make either of us wiser. He wrote lantern, loan, then kerosene pint, 80 cents, pay later. At the bottom of the page he added, if chimney draws, do not celebrate with a large fire. Start with paper, then kindling. Then wait. Smoke tells truth before flame does. The first real work began with the chimney. The shop's flue served an iron potbelly stove in the back room, squat and rust-skinned, with a round belly, 4 curved feet, and a stovepipe running into a brick chimney boxed through the wall. At some point long before the flood, someone had burned trash in it. Sadie found bits of charred paper, nails, and a melted bottle neck in the ashpan. Creosote lined the pipe in black scales, shiny in places, dull and flaky in others. The manual called heavy creosote a fire hazard. Henry called it a waiting insurance claim. She did not own a ladder tall enough to reach the roof, and the club above was not safe to enter, so she worked from below first. She spread ruined rags around the stove, tied the chimney brush to the rope, wrapped a rag around her hair, and fitted the dust mask over her face. The mask smelled faintly of cardboard and warehouse. She removed the stovepipe in sections, each joint resisting, then releasing a black powder that fell over her wrists like ground night. She scraped the lower pipe with a putty knife. Then she fed the brush upward into the flue as far as it would go, twisting, pushing, pulling down, and twisting again. The first fall of creosote came heavy enough to startle her backward. It struck the stove collar and scattered over the floor in flakes, some curled like burnt leaves, some granular as coffee grounds. She waited for the dust to settle before continuing. The work took 6 hours the first day and 4 the next. Her shoulders trembled, her hands cramped around the rope. Twice she had to sit on the floor with her back against the bench because the room spun from holding her head at the wrong angle. Black dust collected in the lines beside her fingernails and would not wash out. When she coughed, it tasted bitter and chemical. Each length of stovepipe had to be brushed, scraped, wiped, tapped, and held to the light. Where pinholes showed, she marked them with chalk and later patched the worst seam with furnace cement, Henry found in a hardened tube and softened by warming it in water. The upper flue remained uncertain. She could not clean what she could not reach. But after 2 days, when she held a smoking twist of newspaper near the stove collar, the smoke leaned inward, not perfectly, not eagerly, inward. That was enough to continue carefully. The first fire came on the 6th evening, no larger than a hand at first. Sadie opened the courtyard door, cracked the little bathroom window, and set the lantern on the floor beyond reach of sparks. She laid paper in the stove, then dry splinters from the broken chair, then 2 narrow pieces of pallet wood Henry had let her pull from behind the feed store. She struck a match. The first one broke, the second flared, sulphur bright, then steadied. Paper took. Kindling whispered. Smoke hesitated at the stove mouth, testing the room, then drew upward through the pipe in a thin grey column. Sadie crouched with one hand on the stove door and watched the draught. Her good ear caught the faint rush when heat found the flue. She waited until the first wood had burned down before adding more. The stove warmed by inches. Rust smell rose. Moisture ticked from somewhere in the pipe. The room did not fill with smoke. For supper she opened one dented can of beans with a church key opener from Landry's bargain drawer and heated it in the enamel pot on the stovetop. The beans took on a taste of metal smoke and hunger. She ate with a screwdriver handle because she had not yet found a spoon she trusted. Steam dampened her face. The first hot meal in that room did not feel like victory. It felt like permission to remain one more night. After the stove, she began the inventory. Bernice had taught her that a workshop must be learned before it can be used. Do not begin with hope, begin with drawers, begin with what is present, what is missing, what is dangerous, what can be saved, what must be left alone until better light. Sadie tore pages from the back of her notebook, preserving the melody pages in front, and made headings across the top. Tools, parts, instruments, papers, hazards unknown. The front display case yielded little. 6 mouthpiece brushes, bristles flattened, 2 trumpet lyres, a cornet mouthpiece with plating worn to brass at the rim, 3 packets of cork ruined, 11 price cards, 1 repair ticket from 1977 written for a Mr. Ellis Boudreau, tenor trombone slide, rush if possible, a cigar box containing pennies, 2 nickels, and a token from a laundry no longer in business. Behind the counter, she found a receipt spike, a roll of brown paper, a stapler swollen shut, and a cash drawer with no cash, only paper clips and a photograph stuck face down in mildew. She did not try to peel it loose. Some things had to dry before being asked to remember. The workroom gave more. On the bench were 2 steel burnishers, both pitted but usable after oiling. 1 rawhide mallet hardened at the head but not split, a bench block, 3 soldering clamps, a half-empty jar of flux gone crusted around the lid, a spool of solder wrapped in wax paper on a shelf above the waterline, a valve casing mandrel, 2 dent rods too rusted for precision but good for rough work, a wooden tray of pearl buttons, most yellowed, some still intact, coffee cans full of springs, screws, water key corks, valve guides, brace feet, ferrules, and bits too particular to name without cleaning. Under the bench, she found instruments. A trumpet with no lead pipe, a marching baritone with the bell flattened on one side, 2 clarinet cases, empty and mould sweet, a trombone slide frozen green at the stockings, a cornet body stripped of valves, a mellophone marked property of St. Augustine High School, the stencil barely visible beneath grime, 3 sousaphone bits in a flour sack, 1 bass drum pedal, which did not belong but had found shelter anyway, a mute shaped like a pear, a child's bugle with red cord rotted to threads. She set each item on cardboard squares, not because cardboard was clean, but because concrete drew damp like a mouth. The papers were worst. Ledgers had swollen into blocks. Repair tickets fused together. Old newspapers had collapsed into felt. She placed what might be saved on the counter and left the rest in place, resisting the urge to hurry. A ruined paper can be destroyed by rescue as easily as neglect. On the 8th day, Henry came by. He stood in the courtyard without entering, because Sadie had asked no one to come down yet, and because he had sense enough to honour the boundary of a person's first shelter. He looked at the hasp she had installed on the door, then at the stairs, then at the smoke rising thinly from the flue. Chimney draws. It draws enough. Enough is a beautiful word when spoken cautiously. He left a sack of day-old rolls from Delphine's Cafe and a folded sheet of paper showing how to mix a mild bleach solution for mould on non-porous surfaces, underlined twice where it said not to mix with ammonia. Sadie thanked him from the bottom of the stairs. He nodded once and left before gratitude could become difficult. That afternoon she cleaned the high shelf above the workbench. She began at the left, removing each object, dusting it, noting it, and placing it below. A row of brass sheet scraps, a bundle of narrow tubing wrapped in twine, a wooden box of dent balls, not Bernice's, but cousins to them, ranging from pea-sized to heavy spheres that filled her palm, a torch tip set in a tin, 2 mandrel handles, a jar of valve oil turned amber and thick as syrup, 3 paper-wrapped packages tied with cotton string and marked only with initials, LB, RB, MC. The sousaphone hung above all of it. For days she had worked under its broad, tarnished bell without touching it. This restraint was partly caution. Heavy instruments fall with no regard for reverence. But it was also something else. Sadie had learned that some objects became loud when approached too directly. Better to let a workshop reveal its order first. On the 9th morning, she tested the room for sound. It was an old habit from Bernice's place. Before beginning serious repair, Bernice would tap benches, bell rims, braces, pipes and walls, learning where metal was alive and where damp had deadened the response. Sadie took the handle of the rawhide mallet and, moving slowly, touched it to each hanging coil of tubing. The first gave a dull green clink, the second rang faintly, the third rattled at a loose joint. She wrote notes, then she touched the sousaphone bell. No ring, not even a dull one. The mallet handle met the bell near the rim and gave back a sound too short, too heavy, as if the brass were not hollow but packed with dense cloth. Sadie frowned and tapped again, higher on the flare. A muted thud. She tapped the lower curve, another. She touched the tubing near the first branch. That part rang, low and tired, but present. The bell throat did not. She set the mallet down. Weight test next. The sousaphone was suspended from 2 hooks by wire twisted through braces. She did not intend to lift it free, only to learn whether the weight matched the instrument. She slid both hands under the lower bow, bent her knees and raised gently, taking just enough weight to feel resistance. It was far heavier than it should have been, not by a little, by the kind of difference a body knows before a mind explains. She let it settle back. For a long time she stood under the bell and looked. The throat, where the broad bell narrowed into the body, had a circular seam that did not belong. At first it seemed like a repair collar. Many large brass instruments carried patches, solder lines, braces added after school years and parade accidents, but this seam was too deliberate. Around the inner throat, just beyond where casual eyes would look, someone had fitted a disc of cedar, thin and darkened, then sealed over it with a brass sleeve and solder. The cedar showed only in one narrow crescent, where age had drawn metal away. Cedar inside brass. That was not repair. That was concealment. Sadie did not open it that day. She cleaned the stove instead. She swept the stairwell. She walked to the library and read 2 pages on corrosion. She returned before dark and sat beneath the sousaphone with the lantern lit low, watching the sealed throat as if it might confess through patience. But metal does not answer impatience, neither does history. On the 10th morning she prepared the bench. She washed the surface with hot water and a little soap, then dried it with rags warmed near the stove. She laid out the tools. She had putty knife, small hacksaw from Henry's lone drawer, soldering clamp, mallet, wire brush, screwdriver, pliers, the cracked rouge cloth, a bowl for screws, and 3 folded towels to catch anything that might fall. She tied the sousaphone to the joist with an added rope before touching the sealed area. If old wire failed, the instrument would still hang. She did not have a torch she trusted. That was a mercy. Heat might have damaged whatever lay inside. Instead, she worked cold. First, she scraped away grime from the solder line, using the putty knife almost flat so she would not gouge the brass. Then she brushed the seam until bright metal showed in thin broken places. She found where the solder had already cracked near the cedar crescent, with the hacksaw blade removed from its frame and wrapped at one end in cloth. She cut shallowly along that weakness, not sawing through, only persuading the old work to admit its edge, the room filled with the smell of metal dust and cedar warmed by friction. It took 2 hours to free the outer sleeve enough to move. Her hands shook from the smallness of the pressure. Twice she stopped to breathe. Once she went outside and stood in the courtyard, letting city air and alley stink replace the close brass smell in her lungs. A delivery truck backed somewhere beyond the wall. A gull cried. Rain threatened but did not fall. When she returned, she placed both thumbs against the brass sleeve and pressed. Nothing. She pressed again, slightly upward, then around. A flake of old solder broke loose and struck the bench. The sleeve shifted by less than 1/8 of an inch. After that, the work became possible. By noon she had removed a curved brass cover no longer than her hand. Behind it sat the cedar disc, fitted into the throat like a stopper. It was not nailed. It had been waxed around the edges, then hidden. The cedar had held its scent through decades. When Sadie slid the putty knife under the rim, the room released a dry, clean fragrance, faint but unmistakable. A closet opened in a house gone damp. She lifted the disc free. Inside the bell throat was darkness. Not empty darkness. Packed darkness. Sadie angled the lantern. The light showed oilcloth. Then canvas. Then the corner of a small metal box wrapped in waxed paper. She did not reach in blindly. Bernice would have rapped her knuckles for that. She made a hook from wire, eased the first bundle toward the opening, and caught it with both hands when it slid free. The bundle was long, wrapped in oiled canvas tied with cotton cord that had browned but not failed. A paper tag, protected under wax. Bore handwriting almost gone. Tools. Sadie placed it on the towel. The second package was flat and heavy, wrapped in brown waxed cloth, marked sheets and stock. Inside, when she would open it later, were narrow brass sheets, 2 lengths of nickel-silver tubing, a packet of valve corks sealed in wax, and small squares of felt still soft because someone had known how damp travels and had refused it entry. The third object was the metal box. It was not large. A desiccant tin, military or medical perhaps, painted dull green and sealed with wax along the lid. It had a wire handle folded flat and a strip of cloth tied around it for lifting. Beneath it, farther inside the throat, were round shapes wrapped separately in oilcloth. Sadie drew them out one by one. Reels, 3 of them, then a 4th. Then 2 smaller reels in metal canisters, each labelled in a careful hand and wrapped against moisture. The labels were not all legible, but enough remained to make her sit down without deciding to. Magnolia Crescent Session. June 1931. Kid Thomas Valentine. Private Take. Lena Bell. Unissued Blues. 1933. Rampart Street Funeral March. Master. Bell Reed Room Mic. Do not copy. Sadie did not know everything about early jazz recordings, but she knew enough to understand that original master tapes were not ordinary property. She also knew enough to understand that old recordings could be ruined by heat, touch, mould, greed, or excitement. She did not open the canisters. She did not unwind a single inch. She placed them on the highest shelf, away from stove heat, and covered them with clean paper. Only then did she open the long bundle marked tools. Inside were not many, but each had been chosen. A polished dent rod with a wooden handle darkened by use, 4 dent balls wrapped separately, their surfaces oiled, a small rawhide mallet softer than the one she had found in the shop, 2 burnishers, 1 straight and 1 curved, a mouthpiece truing tool, a brass caliper etched with initials, a hand vice, a little tin of rouge, and beneath them, wrapped in cloth that had once been blue, a woman's apron folded around a notebook no larger than a hymn book. Sadie did not open the notebook yet. There were too many unopened things in the room already, and the body has limits for receiving. She opened the flat package next because materials had less danger in them. The brass sheets shone dully, preserved under oil paper. The tubing was straight. The felt pads were wrapped in parchment, labelled by thickness. There were valve springs in a waxed envelope, cork sheet, thin leather, 2 packets of screws, and a small envelope of mother-of-pearl buttons no larger than fingernails. All the modest wealth of a trade hidden inside a horn too large to steal easily and too odd to examine casually. The green tin box remained. Sadie carried it to the front counter because it seemed wrong to open money. If money was inside at the workbench where tools had just re-entered the world, she set the lantern to one side and cut the wax seal with the putty knife. The lid resisted, then released with a soft, dry pop. The first thing inside was not currency, but another packet of desiccant, hard as stone. Beneath it lay oilcloth. Beneath that, envelopes. She opened the top envelope. Bills. Old bills, some large, some small, banded in paper strips. Not fresh bank stacks, but collected money, accumulated over time and prepared with care. There were silver certificates, Federal Reserve notes, worn 5s and 10s and 20s, several $100 bills folded into a separate sleeve, and a narrow envelope of coins wrapped in cloth. At the bottom of the box lay a small ledger page, listing deposits by date in a hand that leaned to the right. Sadie counted because a person must count before deciding what not to touch. She counted once and made mistakes. She counted again, laying bills in rows on the counter where the glass beneath was cloudy and cracked. She did not lick her fingers. She used the edge of the rouge cloth to move fragile corners. Some notes were brittle, some were soft from years before the box. She separated denominations, checked each band against the ledger, and wrote totals in the back of her notebook with Bernice's pencil. The bills came to $41,987. The coins made up the rest and more. Morgan silver dollars, peace dollars, Barber half dollars, Mercury dimes, buffalo nickels, wheat pennies, and one gold-quarter eagle wrapped separately in a square of chamois, so worn it felt like skin. There were also 37 cents in ordinary change at the bottom, as if someone had emptied a pocket on the final day and decided even small metal deserved keeping. Together, the cash totaled $42,006.73. Sadie wrote the figure once. Then she put the pencil down. There was one more object in the tin box resting under the coin cloth, a medal on a faded ribbon, bronze gone dark at the edges. She lifted it by the ribbon, not the medal, and turned it toward the lantern. The date on the back was 1945. The name engraved below it had been scratched by time but not erased. Elias Bell. A war medal. A kept wound. A name with weight. Sadie placed it on the folded blue cloth beside the tools. For the rest of the afternoon she moved as if a loud sound had happened and the echo had not yet left. She returned the money to the envelopes. She returned the envelopes to the tin. She did not spend even one coin in imagining that was important. Hunger tried to begin its arithmetic at once, listing food, shoes, a doctor, a lock, a bed, a room above ground. Shame tried another arithmetic, adding all that had been taken from her and subtracting the names of those who took it. But the room was not asking her to become Gavin with older bills. The room was asking her to be exact. She carried the tin box, the tapes, the tools, the materials, and the medal into the workroom and arranged them on the high shelf above the waterline. Then she thought better of it, took the tin down, and hid it in the space beneath the display counter where a panel had warped loose but not fallen. She wrapped the tapes again and placed them in the driest drawer she had found, adding packets of desiccant from the tin and labeling the drawer with pencil. Do not open, do not warm, do not touch. The notebook remained on the bench. Its cover was dark oilcloth tied with a cotton cord on the front. In faded ink someone had written Bell & Reed Private. Sadie untied the cord, then stopped before opening the first page. She had already taken in money, tools, recordings, and a medal. There might be a letter inside. There might be instructions. There might be a claim larger than her capacity to hold after 3 nights of poor sleep and 1 can of beans divided too carefully. She tied the cord again. Not tonight. At dusk, she climbed the stairs, crossed the courtyard, and walked out through the iron gate into the alley behind the club. The rain had passed east, leaving the street washed and shining under the dim lamps. Water ran along the curb, carrying cigarette butts, flower petals, and oil sheen in a ribbon of ruined colours. Sadie stood beneath the broken crescent sign and listened to New Orleans after weather. Somewhere nearby, a trumpet practised scales slowly, not for applause, only for the hand to remember intervals. A woman laughed in the distance. A bus sighed at a stop. From a restaurant vent came garlic, peppers, and hot oil. The city did not know what had been opened under its feet. The city did not care. That too felt like mercy. Sadie walked to the end of the block where rainwater gathered in a low place beside the curb. It reflected the street lamp, the cracked brick, a slice of cloud moving away. She watched the water tremble each time a car passed. She stayed there until the first mosquitoes found her wrists and the night air cooled against her damp sleeves. Then she went back down into the basement, closed the swollen door, barred it from within, and lay behind the counter without opening the notebook. Even silence can keep a song. By morning, the basement had grown colder, though the rain had passed and a stripe of sun lay across the upper wall like a board set there for measuring. Sadie woke before the city above her had gathered its full voice. For a few seconds she did not move. She could feel the hard edge of the trumpet case beneath her neck, the rough wool of her jacket under one cheek, the deep pulse in both heels where the blisters had split again during sleep. The shop smelled of ashes, damp concrete, tarnished brass, and cedar from the disc she had pried loose the day before. The notebook waited on the workbench. She did not look toward it at once. Instead, she rose, folded her blouse back into the case, checked the door wedge, and carried the enamel pot outside to the courtyard spigot. The morning air had that washed New Orleans brightness after hard weather, a shine over broken glass, weeds, blue tile, and wet brick. She filled the pot, strained the water through cloth, boiled it over the stove, and drank half from a coffee tin while standing. Only after the water warmed her hands did she take the oilcloth notebook down from the bench. Its cord had left a pale groove in the cover. The pages had survived because someone had wrapped them with the same care given to the tapes and tools, but they had still aged. Their edges had browned. The first few sheets made a dry whisper when she lifted them. Written on the inside cover, in ink gone sepia, was a name she recognized from the medal, but not from any living mouth. Elias J. Bell. Under it, in another hand, smaller and steadier, someone had written, "If found, begin with the folded letter." Sadie turned one page. The letter lay there, folded along 3 creases, tucked beneath a strip of waxed paper. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. It was not Bernice's. It was older, more formal, each capital made carefully, each line sloping only when the writer had been tired. Yet there was something in the spacing, in the stern refusal to crowd the page, that brought Bernice's workshop back so sharply. Sadie set both palms on the bench. The paper had not been waiting for anyone in particular. That made it harder. She unfolded it slowly, honoring the original creases. "My dear one, whoever you are, if these pages have reached your hands, then the room has outlived us, and some portion of our labour has been spared either by mercy, neglect, or the stubbornness of brass. I'm writing from New Orleans on the 22nd day of October, 1954, after a visit to Dr. Harold Mercier at Charity Hospital, who has told me plainly that the cancer in my blood will not be argued with much longer. I asked him how much time. He said months if I am careful, weeks if I am proud. I told him I had been both all my life and would try at the end to be useful. My name is Miriam Bell Reed. I was born Miriam Bell in 1891 in a back room behind this very shop, when South Rampart still carried more wagons than automobiles and a brass band could make a whole street lean toward its windows. My father was Laurent Bell, born in 1863 near Donaldsonville, son of Etienne Bell, who had been trained as a coppersmith after the war and came downriver with 2 hammers, a charcoal furnace, and a wife named Celestine, who could read better than the priest. Etienne's father, Auguste Belair, before the name was shortened by clerks and impatience, came from St. Martinville in 1828 and beat sugar kettles, lamp reflectors, and church vessels into usefulness before ever touching a horn. My mother was Ruth Ann Whitlow Bell, born in 1868 outside Natchez, Mississippi. She brought with her the habit of keeping accounts in exact columns and the conviction that every tool should be returned clean enough for the next hand. I married Thomas Reed in 1913, when he was already repairing clarinets and saxophones with more confidence than skill. He learned. Men can learn when they stop performing knowledge long enough to receive it. Together we made Bell and Reed from my father's brass bench and Thomas's reed tools, though customers still gave him the hard questions until they saw me answer them faster. There were 4 generations of metal workers before me, Auguste-shaped copper by firelight. Etienne learned brass sheet in the hungry years after Appomattox. Laurent repaired parade horns when jazz was still learning its own name. I was the daughter who stayed, filed ferrules, fitted valve pads, cleaned pistons, drew dents from bells and kept the books when men with fine hats forgot what they owed. The trade did not end on one day, though there is always a day people point to. For us, it was September 18th, 1927, when water from the Great River Year and the storms that followed came through the lower streets and ruined half our stored stock. That date closed more than drawers. Band work changed. Recording men came and went with machines. Younger players bought cheaper instruments from catalogues. Schools repaired less and replaced more. Then the Depression thinned pockets. Then war took brass for other purposes. Then the new clubs wanted noise, quick and bright, not careful repair done slowly in a cellar. Still, we remained. For more than 30 years I kept this shop after the world had already begun leaving it. I opened the door for funeral bands and schoolboys, for widows carrying their husbands' cornets, for working players who paid in quarters, for men who never believed a woman had done the work until they played the horn and had to believe the note. After Thomas died in 1939 from a fever that moved through him faster than prayer, I put his reed tools away and kept only what the brass required. My brother Josiah Bell was lost in France in 1918 during the Great War. My son Elias went into the army in 1942, and came home in 1945 with a medal, a cough, and a silence that sat in the room beside him. He died 7 years later. Some men return from war only by address. I have hidden these things because I could not bear to watch them sold by people who do not know the difference between a dent rod and scrap iron. The money is not a prize. It is wages kept back from years when musicians could not pay, gifts from players who later prospered, insurance money I never used, and what remained after every burial. Spend it only to keep the work from dying, or to keep a living body safe enough to do honest work. If you spend it to become large in the eyes of strangers, it will turn to ashes in your hand. The recordings are more fragile than money and more dangerous to the careless. Do not play them on common machines. Keep them dry, cool, upright, and away from magnetic motors. Find someone who knows preservation, not someone who knows profit first. Some voices on those reels were never pressed or named. A few men recorded in this room because the club upstairs would not let them in by the front door. A woman named Lena Bell, no blood relation but kin in stubbornness, sang here one summer night after being turned away from a Bourbon Street session. Remember her. As for the trade, begin with cleaning, always cleaning. Warm brass, slowly, never above what your hand and experience can justify unless you know the alloy and the joint. For soft solder, work near 360 to 420 degrees Fahrenheit and let the solder follow heat, not flame. Use 1 part rosin flux thinned with 2 parts alcohol for clean seams, but scrape old joints until bright before trusting any mixture. Valve pads must seat flat, never proud. Cork should compress without crumbling. When drawing a dent, choose a ball just smaller than the injury's memory, not the wound's present shape. Work from the edge inward, polish last, and less than vanity demands. Lacquer can make a liar of bad work, but only until the next season. If the chimney still stands, draw smoke gently before sleeping here. If the stair has failed, build from the bottom up and do not trust a board because it looks straight. If water has come again, lift everything worth saving above the line it left behind. Mark dates, mark names. A craft without records becomes a rumour, and rumours cannot teach the next pair of hands. Inheritance is not what the prosperous say it is not silver laid out in velvet boxes, nor land with clean papers, nor a portrait above a mantle. Inheritance is often a burden wrapped so carefully it can be mistaken for refuse. It is the knowledge of how to mend what others would discard. It is the discipline not to take praise too seriously or damage too personally. It is a bench scarred by hands you will never meet, asking whether you are willing to become patient. I do not know you. You may be blood of mine, or you may be a stranger who bought ruin, because ruin was all you could afford. Either way, if you have opened this, then you have already been chosen by need, which is sterner and more honest than romance. Take what is useful, leave what should remain. Add your name only after you have earned the right to keep the room. There is one marker outside. If the walnut tree has survived in the back court, Thomas drove a horseshoe into the trunk the week Elias was born, open end upward, because he believed luck should have a place to gather. Under that tree, we buried nothing of money. We buried only the first cracked mouthpiece my father ever repaired for pay and a spoon Celestine carried from upriver. I mention it so you will know we were real. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Miriam Bell Reed. Bell and Reed Brass Repair. October 22nd, 1954. Sadie read the letter once without lifting her hands from the bench. Then she read it again. The second time she stopped at certain lines, not because she meant to, but because the paper seemed to ask for slower breath. Men can learn when they stop performing knowledge, spend it only to keep the work from dying. Some men return from war only by address, a ball just smaller than the injury's memory. A stranger who bought ruin because ruin was all you could afford. When she finished, the room had not changed. The stove still held last night's ash. The walls still carried floodstains. The sousaphone still hung opened and dim, its secret throat exposed. Yet the bench beneath her palms had become less like salvage and more like a table where someone had set a place. Sadie folded the letter along its original creases. She did not smooth them away. The creases belonged to the woman who had made them, and some forms of care meant not improving what age had earned. She placed the letter back inside the notebook, then placed the notebook in the trumpet case beside Bernice's pencil. She stood a while, looking down at the case, at the cracked leather, at the brass latches dulled by years of bus floors and station corners. Then she closed it gently. The back door to the courtyard stuck in the damp, but less than before. Sadie lifted it with her shoulder and stepped outside. The day had warmed, sunlight angled down between the brick walls, touching the weeds, the broken chair, the cut chain, the blue tiles, and the wet place where water still collected near the drain. At first she saw no then, beyond a courtyard wall where a section of iron fencing leaned outward into an overgrown service yard, she saw a trunk rising behind a tangle of vine and trash bamboo. The walnut had survived. It was taller than the building's second story, its bark ridged deep and black in the furrows, its new leaves unfolding with the fragile green of things that had not asked permission. The lower branches reached over the rear wall as if the tree had spent decades trying to look into the courtyard. Sadie found a loose brick, then another, and used them as steps to climb high enough to see the trunk more clearly. The horseshoe was there. Time had nearly swallowed it. The iron had rusted dark, and the tree had grown around the sides, holding it the way flesh holds a splinter it has decided not to reject. Only the curved crown and one nail head showed plainly. The open end still faced upward. Rainwater had gathered in the curve, no more than a spoonful, and a mosquito balanced on the surface until Sadie's shadow crossed it. She reached over the wall and touched the exposed iron with 2 fingers. Not for luck. For witness. Below the horseshoe, half buried in leaves and broken brick, something pale caught the light. Sadie climbed down, found a narrow gap in the leaning fence, and worked her way through to the service yard. The ground was soft, bottle glass shifted under her shoe. She knelt at the base of the walnut and brushed away leaves until she uncovered a small patch of brick set flat in the soil, perhaps an old drain border, or the remains of a planting bed. She did not dig. The letter had said nothing buried there needed taking. She sat back on her heels. A cracked mouthpiece. A spoon. Not treasure. Proof. When she returned to the shop, she brought with her 1 fallen walnut twig and 3 leaves, which she placed on the bench beside the folded blue cloth. Then she searched the drawers for the candle she had noticed days before and not yet trusted. It was in the upper right drawer of the customer counter, wrapped in yellowed newspaper dated 1962, a beeswax candle hand-dipped, bent slightly in the middle, with a wick that had blackened at one tip but never been lit. Perhaps it had been kept for storms, perhaps for a funeral, perhaps for no reason except that useful things remain useful until someone decides otherwise. Sadie set it in an empty valve spring tin and warmed the bottom near the stove until the wax softened enough to hold. She struck a match. The flame took small and blue at first, then rose gold. It did not banish the basement's dampness. It did not make the room whole. It only placed one living light on the counter, where repair tickets had gone mold-soft and where old coins had been counted under a lantern the night before. The candle smelled faintly of honey and dust. Its flame leaned each time the stairwell breathed. Sadie carried the candle to the workbench and set it in front of the notebook. One by one, the names of small kindnesses began to gather around the flame, though she did not speak them. Mrs. Talley in Hammond opening a paper sack and pretending the boiled egg was extra. The reference librarian in New Orleans sliding over the transit map without asking for a story. Mrs. Carver warning her honestly and turning a bill into something kept in a desk drawer. Henry Landry writing her name on a credit page as if names could still begin clean. Delphine, whom she had not met yet, but whose day-old rolls had crossed the courtyard in Henry's hands. None of those gestures had announced itself as rescue. That was why they had reached her. A large mercy can make a person suspicious when she has been handled by bargains. A small mercy leaves room. It does not demand the whole face turned upward in gratitude. It sets down an egg, a map, a warning, a lantern, a paper bag of rolls, then steps back far enough for dignity to remain standing. And you, watching from wherever evening has found you, may have one of those mercies stored somewhere in your own life. Not the grand sort people make speeches about, but the cup of coffee paid for without ceremony, the ride offered in rain, the teacher who waited after class, the neighbor who shoveled a walk, the stranger who told the truth when a lie would have been easier. If you remember one, write it down in the comments. Say what was given, say who gave it, if you can. Some kindnesses are kept alive only because somebody finally names them. Sadie waited until the candle burned low enough to pool wax in the spring tin. Then she pinched the flame with wet fingers, because blowing dust across the bench felt careless now. Before sleep, she made a different arrangement of the room. The money stayed hidden beneath the counter panel. The tapes remained upright and wrapped in the driest drawer. The medal lay beside the notebook inside the trumpet case, cushioned with the folded blouse. The tools from the sousaphone she wrapped again in the blue cloth and placed under her jacket within reach. Bernice's pencil she tucked into the notebook's spine, though it belonged to another woman's line. That did not feel wrong. Craft had already crossed stranger borders than blood. She ate the last of the rolls with water warmed on the stove. Then she cleaned the crumbs from her palm and placed the walnut leaves between two dry pages at the back of her melody notebook, pressing them flat with the care once reserved for sheet music. When the basement darkened, she lay down behind the counter as before, but not as before. The concrete was still cold. Her heels still hurt. The building above was still condemned by people who had not entered with patience. Rats still moved somewhere in the ceiling, and water still ticked in a place she had not found. Nothing practical had changed enough to save her, yet the heirloom tools rested beside her, and the folded letter lay within arm's reach, and the name Miriam Bell Reed had entered the room like a lamp left burning for someone late. Sadie turned onto her right side, good ear upward, damaged ear against the folded jacket, and placed one hand on the closed trumpet case. She slept that way, guarding and guarded. The first snow came on December 4th, not as a Louisiana snow, not the brief white rumour people mention for years afterward, but as sleet at the edge of freezing rain that clicked against the tin shed roof above the courtyard and left a silver crust along the alley bricks. By morning, 3 inches of wet weight had gathered on the upper roof of the abandoned club, melting and refreezing in the gutters, forcing water through places where the building had already forgotten how to protect itself. Sadie heard it before she saw it. Not rain now, not the single patient drip she had learned to count, but a heavier knocking above the workroom, an irregular tapping that moved from joist to joist like a hand searching for the weakest board. She climbed the stairs with Henry's lantern and stood in the courtyard. Looking up, the roofline above Bell and Reed belonged to the back portion of the old club, a lower extension built of brick, patched with timber and covered in asphalt shingles worn bald at the edges. Several had lifted. One strip near the gutter hung folded over itself, black underside showing. A rusted downspout had come loose from its bracket, spilling meltwater against the rear wall instead of carrying it toward the drain. Above the workroom, the eaves sagged by a visible inch. Sadie went back inside, warmed her hands over the stove, and read the roofing chapter in Henry's manual 3 times. The first reading gave her terms: decking, felt, flashing, drip edge, starter course, exposure. The second gave her order: strip, inspect, patch, underlay, line, nail, cap. The third gave her enough fear to be useful. Roofs were not furniture. A bad shelf embarrassed a room. A bad roof ruined everything beneath it slowly without apology. She measured from inside first, counting joist spacing and marking the leak points with chalk. Then she measured outside from the courtyard wall, using a string weighted with a rusted nut, because she had no proper plumb bob. The roof over the rear extension was narrow but treacherous, 14 feet from wall to gutter and 32 feet along the back, with one brick chimney piercing the left third and a shallow pitch that invited water to linger. The south corner had failed where 2 rafters met a rotten plate. Her material calculation filled 2 notebook pages. 6 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles, enough for a little more than 5 squares after waste. 1 roll of 15-pound roofing felt. 2 pounds of 1¼ inch galvanized roofing nails, 1 bundle of wooden shims, 2 tubes roofing cement, 8 feet of aluminum drip edge, 1 sheet of 1/2 inch exterior plywood for patching soft decking, 4 sister rafter boards 2x6, 8 feet long, because the sag near the eave had a reason and reasons had to be addressed before surfaces. She took the list to Landry's feed and seed with both hands tucked in her coat pockets to keep them from stiffening. Henry read it behind the counter, lips moving slightly at the figures. Outside, the sleet had become rain, and customers came in stamping mud from their boots, buying feed, propane, batteries and coffee in paper cups. The store smelled of damp canvas and kerosene. Sadie stood still while Henry added numbers and crossed out 2 items, replacing them with cheaper equivalents he could trust. "You do not need new drip edge if I have bent stock in the shed. I can pay later." "You have said that often enough to qualify as a hymn." He went into the back and returned with a hatchet wrapped in newspaper. The head was narrow, dark with use, and the handle had been smoothed by a hand larger than Sadie's. One side of the pole carried a shallow chip, not dangerous, only known. "My Uncle Theo roofed half the houses between here and Kenner after Betsy," Henry said. This was his. Roofing hatchet, not a chopping toy. Gauge notches are worn, but the edge is honest. Use it or leave it alone. Sadie held it carefully. What would he want for it? He is dead, so his bargaining has become limited. Henry wrote hatchet, loan, no charge, then paused. "You will not do that roof alone." "I have done a loan before, not that." He looked past her through the store window where rain stitched the parking lot in slant lines. "There is a man named Abel Thibodeau, 72, roofer until his knees became weather, lives behind St. Agnes. He will refuse pay because refusal is one of his illnesses. Ask him to stand below and insult your work. That is how he teaches." Abel Thibodeau arrived the next morning without being fetched, which meant Henry had already sent word. He was tall in the way some aged men remain tall after the body has begun giving back its height, with a long neck, narrow shoulders, and a face weathered into clean planes. His left knee did not bend fully. He carried a cane made from pipe, wore a canvas coat shiny at the elbows, and had one eye clouded milky from an accident he did not explain. He stood in the courtyard looking up at the roof. "You light." Sadie was not certain she had heard him correctly. "Sir. Light enough not to break what's half broke," he pointed with his cane. "But you step wrong. You will come through like judgment." They worked 11 days, though not all day every day. Weather decided. Light decided. Abel's knee decided. Sadie's hands decided when they could no longer close around a nail. First, they set a ladder from the courtyard to the low roof, tied it at the top, tied it again at the bottom, and Abel made her climb halfway, come down, climb again, and come down a third time until he believed she knew not to hurry. Then they stripped the worst shingles with the roofing hatchet, not tearing wildly, but lifting tabs, pulling nails, stacking debris by type. Abel stood below most of the time, head tipped back, calling instruction in short measures. "That nail's proud." Sadie leaned closer. "Pull it." She pulled. "Do not bury rot." She cut the soft decking back to a sound edge. "Line tells truth." She snapped a chalk line across felt. Blue powder breaking clean in the cold air. The failed rafter was uglier than it had looked from below. Its end had softened where water entered behind the fascia. Abel showed her how to sister a rafter. Cut the new 2x6 to span beyond the damaged area. Fit it tight against the original. Clamp if possible. Then drive screws in a staggered pattern so the old and new carried weight together without splitting. They used 3-inch structural screws Henry found in a dusty box behind the counter, not nails, because the wood had already endured enough violence. Sadie worked from her knees. Gold moving through the denim. Sawdust sticking to her sleeves. Each screw took pressure. Her wrist ached. Abel watched from the ladder, silent until she tried to force one at a bad angle. Back it out. She did. Again, by the 5th day, The sag had lifted enough to make the eave line less sorrowful. They replaced the decking patch, rolled felt from low to high, overlapping each course by 2 inches, and weighted it with scrap brick until it could be nailed. Abel taught the 3-stroke nail, set, drive, finish. Not hard enough to cut the shingle, not soft enough to leave the head high. He made her pull 20 nails before noon. "That one's proud. Pull it," Sadie said before he could. He looked at her with his clouded eye and almost smiled. The work changed her hearing on the roof. She could not rely on the rooms contained echoes. Trucks, rain, crows, distant horns, Abel's voice, all arrived broken by open air. She learned to position herself so his instruction came to her right side. Abel noticed after 2 days, and without mentioning it, moved accordingly. That kind of mercy required no thanks because it had disguised itself as efficiency. By mid-December, the rear roof was not new, but it was no longer surrendering. The last ridge of shingles lay flat. The patched decking held. The downspout was reattached with 2 straps and a section of pipe Henry had saved from a demolished shed. Around the chimney, Abel made her scrape the flashing clean and embed roofing cement beneath the loose edge with a putty knife warmed in her coat pocket. Then he pressed the seam with both thumbs until black tar edged out evenly. "Water's lazy," he said, but patient. Sadie looked at the roof, at the chalk on her hands, at the old hatchet on the tar paper. "So we be more patient." Abel gave one nod. "Now you learned something." That afternoon, rain came steady for 2 hours. Sadie stood in the workroom beneath the repaired roof with a lantern in one hand, watching the joists. Nothing fell. Nothing tapped. Nothing darkened along the ceiling seam. The shop held its breath, and the roof held with it. In January the bricks began to confess. It happened during a hard, cold spell that surprised even the people who liked to say they had seen every kind of weather the Gulf could send. The nights dropped into the 20s. The courtyard spigot had to be wrapped in rags and burlap. The stove became not comfort but necessity. And because necessity tests every repair honestly, the chimney revealed its next failing with powder on the floor. At first, Sadie thought it was ash tracked from the stove door. Then she noticed the pale grit collecting beneath the chimney breast, reddish tan and fine as cornmeal. When she pressed one finger to the mortar between the lower bricks, it crumbled. Not all of it. Not enough for collapse. Enough for warning. The manual named it spalling, freeze, moisture, salt, age, heat, all conspiring in slow shifts until brick faces flaked and mortar joints surrendered their binding. Sadie found bricks on the exterior stack whose surfaces had scaled off in thin shells. Inside, near the stove collar, the joints had powdered back nearly 1/2 inch. Smoke still drew, but the pathway had become less a throat than a memory of one. Henry examined it on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the workroom with his cap pulled low and one hand behind his back. "Do not use Portland cement on that. I was going to ask." "Good." Asking prevented a sin. He brought from Landry's a torn paper sack of hydraulic lime, a smaller sack of fire clay, and sand screened through a mesh crate that had once held oranges. The lime had been stored high and dry. The fire clay came from an unopened bag his father had purchased in the 1950s for stovework that never happened, the printing on it faded but legible. Henry set it on the bench as if placing an elder in a chair. 3 parts sand, he said. 1 part hydraulic lime for the outer joints. Near heat, add fire clay. Equal fire clay and lime to 3 sand for the collar area. Not soup. Not crumbs. Peanut butter, if peanut butter had moral responsibility. Sadie wrote the ratios down. For 3 weeks she worked in temperatures that made her fingers slow and the water in the mixing bucket skin over if left near the stair. Each morning began with raking out failed mortar. She used a narrow cold chisel, a wire brush and patience that felt less noble by the hour. No joint could be packed over dust. She scraped until the remaining mortar held firm. She brushed, she vacuumed with a hand pump borrowed from Henry. its canvas bag coughing more dust than it caught. She misted the brick lightly so the new mortar would not dry too fast and fail from thirst. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. Gloves were too clumsy for pressing mortar into narrow joints, so she worked bare until her fingers lost exactness, then tucked them under her arms, walked 2 circles around the room and held them near the stovepipe without touching. When feeling returned, it came as small needles under the nails. She did not curse. She had begun conserving words as carefully as heat. The mortar work was deliberate. Load the tuck pointer, press deep, pack the back of the joint first, add more, strike clean, brush only after thumbprint hard. She learned the difference between mortar that sagged because it was too wet and mortar that tore because it was too dry. She learned that old brick will accept repair if not bullied, but it does not forgive haste. Abel stopped by twice, though chimneys were not his trade. "Looks ugly," he said the first time. "It is not finished." Then it looks honest. The second time, he brought a short plank and showed her how to brace her elbow while working above shoulder height. Then he left without coffee, as if remaining would make kindness too visible. Smoke tests came in stages. First a twist of newspaper, then 1 handful of shavings, then 3 sticks of dry pallet wood. Each time Sadie watched the joints with a lantern, looking for a thin dark leak, sniffing for smoke where only cold brick should be. The flue drew better after she cleared the loose mortar crumbs from the clean-out at the base. She had not known there was a clean-out until Henry's manual mentioned one, and she scraped paint from a square iron plate hidden behind a storage crate. Late January, on a night when the temperature fell to 26 degrees, she built the first full test fire. Not large, full enough. The stove accepted paper, then kindling, then 2 split pieces of hardwood Henry had traded from a customer who owed him for feed. Flame took slowly. The pipe ticked as it warmed. Sadie crouched by the chimney breast with her face close to the repaired joints, her good ear turned toward the drawer. The smoke went up clean. No grey seam escaped. No cough of backdraft came through the stove door. The room warmed without warning against her. She sat on the floor, back against the counter, and opened her hands toward the heat. The cold had not left. It had only been answered. The floors in the shop were concrete, but the small office alcove behind the front counter still held wood. Sadie had avoided that alcove for weeks because it was where the paper damage was worst and because the threshold sagged under the weight of a story she had not wanted to disturb. It had once been the place where bills were written, receipts filed, and customers told to come back Thursday, not Wednesday, because brass does not repair itself by wishing. The room was barely 6 by 9 feet, panelled on 2 sides with beadboard, with a narrow built-in desk under a high window painted shut. The floorboards were white pine, hand-cut, laid over sleepers above the concrete. Floodwater had warped some beyond saving, but not all under the grime. Beneath silt and mildew and curled flakes of varnish, the boards had remained. Their nails were rosehead, hand-cut, dark and square at the shank, driven by someone who had known the value of a line. Sadie pried up only the worst 3 boards near the wall, numbering their places in pencil before lifting. Beneath them she found damp dirt, 2 bottle caps, and a repair ticket from 1941 that had dried into lace. Henry found replacement pine in the loft above his store, boards salvaged from a porch removed before a highway widening. They were not exact, but close enough after planing. He sold them as scrap and wrote nothing on the credit page that day, Sadie noticed. Henry noticed that she noticed and became very occupied with weighing nails for another customer. She rented a random orbit sander from a tool shop near Tulane Avenue for $14 a day, paying with 1 coin from the loose change in the shop's cigar box and the first $2 she earned cleaning storeroom shelves for Delphine before dawn. The deposit was waived because Henry called ahead, which he denied. The sander was loud enough to trouble her damaged ear even through cotton. She worked with her right side angled away, pausing often to let the ringing settle. First came 80 grit, coarse and humbling, taking off blackened varnish, raised grain, water stains, and the rough ridges where boards had cupped. Dust rose in pale clouds. It settled on her hair, lashes, sleeves, and the repaired desk, turning her into something flour-dusted and ghostly. The first pass revealed damage. The second revealed wood. With 120 grit, the boards began to smooth under her palm. Not perfect, honest, nail heads appeared like dark stars. The replacement boards stood out at first, paler and less worn, but Sadie feathered the edges by hand, softening the difference without pretending it was not there. The final pass, 220 grit, took all afternoon because she went slowly around the rosehead nails, refusing to grind them flat for the convenience of shine. Finishing took longer than sanding. She chose a mixture Henry recommended for stubborn wood. Tung oil thinned for the first coat, then linseed oil warmed slightly near the stove for later coats, each rubbed in with cloth and left to cure. 3 coats, 48 hours between them. No rushing. No walking early, no setting boxes down because impatience had an errand. The first coat sank in almost immediately, as if the pine had been thirsty for years. The second gave depth. The third brought colour up from below. What had looked grey became dark honey. Then, in the seams and near the desk legs, mahogany shadows rose where age and oil met. Sadie knelt with the rag folded in her hand and worked the final coat along the grain, board by board. The room took light differently after that. Even the high window, still cloudy, seemed to send down a warmer stripe. The desk no longer appeared abandoned, only waiting for papers that deserved dry wood beneath them. The bad morning came 2 days later. No single thing caused it. That was what made it difficult. The roof held, the chimney drew, the alcove floor cured beneath its third coat. The door locked better than before. The money remained hidden, the tapes remained untouched, the letter remained folded. There was work enough for months, and because there was work she should have risen gladly, should have boiled water, should have mixed bleach solution, should have scraped, sorted, sanded, patched, written, carried, called, asked, repaired. Instead, she sat on the bottom stair with one shoe in her hand and could not make herself put it on. The body had kept accounts. Her shoulders had become rope. Her palms had split near the thumbs. Her left ear rang so sharply that the stove's tick seemed far away, though it stood only across the room. Hunger had improved but not vanished. Sleep came in pieces. Gratitude, even when real, did not replace rest. Sadie set the shoe down. She walked without breakfast through the back streets toward the marsh edge beyond the canal, where the city loosened and the water grasses took over. It was not wilderness. There were power lines, trash caught in reeds, a chain-link fence bent open, and the distant hum of traffic. But there was also open water grey under a low sky, and a great blue heron standing in it with one leg lifted, patient as a carved thing. Sadie sat on a concrete drainage block and did not work that day. She watched the heron take one step in half a minute, then another. It did not apologize for stillness. It did not explain its waiting to the water. When it struck, the motion was exact and almost too quick to see. Then it returned to silence, the fish already gone. By afternoon, clouds broke in narrow places. Light moved across the marsh and touched the bird's back with a blue so brief it felt private. Sadie ate a roll from her pocket, drank water from a jar, and let the day pass without being useful. At dusk she returned to the shop. Nothing had collapsed because she had rested. No ancestor withdrew welcome. No debt collector appeared. The floors cured without her. The chimney stood. The roof held. The sousaphone, opened now and emptied of its long secret, hung lighter above the bench. She stood in the doorway of the office alcove and looked at the oiled pine. The boards did not shine loudly. They held light close, as hand-worn wood does. Even silence can keep a song. February brought windows, and windows brought the problem of admitting the world without inviting weather in after it. There were 8 windows in the shop and rear rooms, counting the high-painted ones above the workbench, the little toilet closet window, the office alcove sash, and 3 narrow panes set along the courtyard wall where daylight entered reluctantly. 3 had no glass at all, only plywood nailed over the openings from inside after some storm or trespass. 4 were cracked, one with a spiderweb break that turned every shaft of light into a fractured fan. The last was original or close enough to make Sadie cautious. The original window sat in the front room, high above the customer counter, almost hidden by grime. Its glass was wavy, faintly green at the edge, with tiny bubbles suspended inside like breath caught during cooling. The muntins were pegged, not nailed. On the lower rail, beneath layers of paint, someone had scratched a date with a knife point, 1788. It might have come from another building and been reused, as materials often were in cities that rebuilt themselves from what survived. It might have marked a repair rather than birth. Either way, Sadie did not replace it. She began with assessment. Each sash was eased from its frame if it could be moved. If it could not, she cut paint lines with a utility blade Henry gave her and worked a putty knife along the seam until the wood admitted motion. Rotten sections she marked in pencil. Loose glazing came away in dull crumbs. Old points rusted into the rabbets. Where glass was missing, she measured twice, then made cardboard templates because the frames had shifted over years, and square measurements lied. Henry ordered glass from a supplier who still cut single panes for people who did not want vinyl replacements. Sadie carried the smaller panes herself, wrapped in newspaper and tied with twine, holding them upright against her body as if carrying sheet music in wind. The largest pane came in the back of Henry's truck, and he refused to let her unload it without Abel, who arrived, looked at the glass, and said, "Do not sneeze." The glazing putty was DAP 33, oil-based, dense and pale, stiff at first in the February cold. Sadie warmed the can near the stove, not close enough to skin, then kneaded a lump in her palm until it softened. Henry had shown her on a scrap frame how to bed the glass. Lay a thin rope of putty in the rabbet. Press the pane gently so it seated without rocking. Set glazing points every 8 inches or so with the putty knife. Then run the final bevel smooth from corner to corner. Smooth was harder than it looked. Her first bevel wandered thick at one end, thin at the other. She scraped it off and began again. The second trapped an air pocket again. The third held, not elegant but sealed. By the 4th window her wrist learned the angle. By the 6th she could draw the putty knife in one slow pull, leaving a sloped line that would shed rain instead of holding it. The sash cords came next. 2 windows still had counterweights hidden in their pockets, iron cylinders resting at the bottom because the cotton cords had rotted through decades before. Sadie removed the trim carefully, labeling each piece on the back. Henry sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from a spool so old the outer layer had yellowed. She fed it over the pulley, tied a figure-8 knot through the counterweight eye, tested the drop, then tied the sash end with hands that had grown better at knots since the roof. The first time a repaired sash rose and stayed open by itself, Sadie stood back and laughed once. The sound startled her. It was not a large laugh, not a performance, only one breath escaping before she could make it orderly. It struck the glass, came back from the ceiling, and vanished into the workroom. She placed a hand over her mouth, then lowered it. There was no one there to measure whether it had been proper. She left the original pane for last. For that one she did not remove the sash. She cleaned around it with cotton swabs, warm water and a patience that made the day narrow. The old putty had hardened like stone in places and vanished entirely in others. She used a dental pick from Henry's odds drawer to clear loose grit without disturbing the fragile glass. Where the glazing had failed, she pressed new putty in with her fingers rather than a knife, shaping it as gently as clay around a relic. The pane gave a wavering view of the street beyond, not clear, but alive. Outside, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch that reached over the rear wall. Sadie saw it through the repaired courtyard window while cleaning the last smear of putty from her thumb. The bird was compact and round against the cold black cap, neat as ink, feet gripping the branch with complete faith in something thinner than a pencil. It turned its head once, then again, searching the bark. Its beak tapped. A tiny flake of moss fell. Behind it, the horseshoe remained partly swallowed by the trunk, open end upward, holding a spoonful of rain from the night before. Sadie stood inside with the putty knife in one hand and the sash cord fibers caught on her sleeve. The shop was not warm. Not yet. It was not safe enough, not clean enough, not ready for work that could be offered to another person without apology. The upper club still leaned into its long neglect. The city still had papers that could flatten a life in red ink, but light now entered through glass instead of holes, and when the wind moved along the courtyard, it no longer came straight through the room as if the walls had given up. She lowered the final sash. It settled into place with a careful wooden sound. The plaster failed where heat and water had argued for too many years. It did not fall all at once. That would have been simpler in the blunt way of disasters that arrive with noise. Instead, it loosened in 3 patches near the chimney breast, each one shaped like a continent on an old-school map. Edges curled slightly away from the wall, center still clinging with the pride of something not yet ready to be swept into a bucket. Sadie noticed the first patch after the chimney test, when fire had warmed the brick enough to draw moisture outward. A pale blister opened above the stovepipe. When she pressed it with 2 fingers, the surface moved. Not much. Enough. Behind the broken plaster was hand-split oak lath, narrow strips fastened with old square nails, each strip rough on the surface so plaster could bite into it. Horsehair curled through the remaining plaster in dark threads, stronger than it looked, binding lime and sand the way memory binds separate days until they can hold weight together. Sadie stood with the lantern lifted close and studied the wall before touching it further. This was not drywall. It could not be cut out, replaced, and made flat by afternoon. It was layered work. Slow work. Work that looked simple only to people who had never tried to make a wall breathe and hold. Henry had a bag of horsehair in his store's upper room, though he seemed mildly offended by its existence. "My father bought it from a plaster man in 1957, he said, dragging the dusty sack down a ladder while Sadie held the base steady. Said it would come in useful. My mother said if he kept enough useless things, one day the world might surrender and make him right." The sack smelled of old barn, dust, and time. The hair inside was clean enough after shaking. Long dark strands mixed with grey and chestnut. Henry also found hydrated lime, fine sand, and a smaller amount of gauging plaster whose paper bag had been folded tight against damp. He would not let her carry all of it at once. Plaster falls for 3 reasons, he said. Bad key, bad mix, bad impatience. Avoid 2 of the 3, and the wall may forgive the 3rd. Sadie wrote the order in the notebook. First, remove what had already failed, not what looked imperfect, only what had lost grip. She tapped the wall with the handle of the putty knife, listening for the difference between held plaster and hollow shell. The sound had to be learned. Solid plaster gave back a dull, settled note. Loose plaster answered with a papery knock. She marked the boundaries in pencil, then cut along them with a utility blade so the good portions would not tear away with the bad. The first patch came off in 3 pieces. Behind it, the lath remained mostly sound. She brushed away crumbs, vacuumed dust with Henry's hand pump, and misted the wood until it darkened. The lath had to be damp enough not to steal water too quickly from the new plaster, but not so wet it rejected the mix. Like many repairs, it required an exact middle no one could name for you. The scratch coat was coarse. Lime sand, a modest measure of plaster, and horsehair pulled apart by hand until it distributed through the mortar rather than clumping. Sadie mixed in a shallow pan with a hoe handle cut short, turning the material until it held together without slumping. She pressed it through the spaces between lath so it pushed out behind and formed keys, those rough curled grips that would harden unseen and hold the wall from the back. Then she scored it. Horizontal scratches, not decorative, drawn with an old combed piece of wood so the next coat would have something to seize. Her hand grew tired quickly. The plaster dragged differently from mortar. It had a living stickiness, a resistance that asked to be spread, not smeared. By the end of the first patch, her wrist trembled, and horsehair clung to her sleeves like fine black thread. The brown coat came 3 days later, after the scratch coat had set firm, but not become indifferent. 3/8 of an inch. Henry had said it twice, so Sadie made a gauge from scrap wood and checked the depth along the edges. This coat was smoother, with less hair, worked outward from the centre and feathered toward the old plaster. She kept the surface slightly rough. The wall did not need vanity yet. It needed structure. 72 hours. That was the cure time, she wrote beside the stove, though the cold made everything slower. During those days she did not poke the plaster, did not lean tools against it, did not warm it too quickly with a large fire. She let the shop remain cool. The repaired windows held back most wind. The roof did not leak above the patch. The chimney warmed the room by degrees and no longer powdered the floor. Each repaired thing made space for the next to endure. The finish coat was thin, 1/8 of an inch, lime-rich and pale. Sadie mixed only enough for one patch at a time. She applied it with the broad knife Henry had sharpened for her, then troweled it smooth in long strokes, wiping the blade often so grit would not drag. It did not become perfect. The old wall was not perfect. A dead flat patch would have looked like a lie set inside an honest face. She followed the plane of the surrounding plaster, slight waves included, letting the new work belong to the old. When the third patch had set, she stood in the workroom with her hands white to the wrist and studied the chimney wall. The repairs showed if a person knew where to look. Fine. Let them show. The wall had been wounded and mended, not replaced with something that had never suffered weather. She touched one dry edge with her fingertips. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said. The room gave no answer. It did not need to. Doris Melancon owned Delphine's Cafe, though nobody in town called it Doris's, because her mother's name had been painted on the awning in 1968, and repainting a beloved name felt like poor manners. Doris was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s with silver threaded through black curls, wrists strong from lifting stockpots, and a pencil tucked above her ear, whether she was doing sums or not. She wore white aprons over flowered dresses and had a way of looking at a person that did not pry but did not pretend blindness either. The first time Sadie came in through the side door before dawn to scrub storeroom shelves for cash, Doris handed her a biscuit wrapped in wax paper and kept talking about the work as if food had appeared by law. The storeroom smelled of onions, coffee beans, bleach and flour. Sadie cleaned shelves, broke down boxes, swept beneath the soda crates, and washed the lower wall where years of deliveries had left grey marks. Doris paid in folded bills from the register, counted aloud, no pity added, and no discount taken. But after the roof work began, paper bags started appearing just inside the courtyard gate. At first Sadie thought Henry had brought them. Then she found one folded with neat square corners and tied with kitchen twine, containing rice, 2 boiled eggs, a wedge of cornbread, coffee grounds wrapped in paper, and a jar of gumbo thick enough to hold a spoon upright. On top lay a receipt slip with no prices, only Delphine's Cafe stamped in blue ink. Sadie carried the empty jar back the next morning. "I need to pay you," she said. Doris was kneading biscuit dough on a flowered table. She did not look up. "You did. Shelves look better." That was separate. Everything is separate until hunger gets involved. I cannot take food for nothing. Doris folded dough over itself once, twice, palms pressing with calm force. "Then pay me in candles when the shop reopens." Sadie stood still. Candles. You got a basement. Basements need candles. People like buying what makes sense in the place where they buy it. Doris cut the biscuits with a tin ring, each one exact. You can put them by the counter, plain ones, no perfume nonsense. Beeswax if Henry can find some. I will take 6 when you are ready. The shop is not open. I did not say tomorrow. Doris lifted the cut biscuits onto a tray. Her face remained practical, almost stern. "Bring the jar back clean. That is payment enough for now." After that, the bags came twice a week, not lavishly, never too much. Soup in jars, heel ends of bread, rice, beans, bruised apples, a paper twist of salt. sometimes coffee. Each bag was placed where rain could not reach it. Each bag looked like an errand, not charity. And Sadie began to understand that Doris knew exactly how to leave dignity intact because she had once needed someone to leave hers. Caleb first appeared with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle leaning against the iron gate. He was 16, maybe 17, all elbows, height and watchfulness, with brown hair falling into his eyes and a school backpack patched with duct tape. His bicycle was red beneath scratches, its chrome-dulled one-handlebar grip replaced with electrical tape. The splitting maul looked too large for him until he swung it. Then it became clear the boy had been splitting wood long enough to let the tool do its own falling. "You Miss Broussard," he said. "Sadie. My mother said you need wood cut." Sadie wiped her hands on her apron. "I did not ask your mother." "No, Mam-am." He said it without offence. "That was only a fact. Who is your mother?" "Mrs. Landry's niece. She cleans at St. Agnes." "She said about your aunt." Sadie paused. Caleb shifted the maul from one hand to the other. "Not the whole. Just that she fixed my grandfather's horn once and did not charge after his layoff. He played it at church till he died. The courtyard was full of scrap wood by then, pallet pieces, broken shelving, sections of ruined framing. Abel had judged unworthy for structure but good for stove lengths if cut. Sadie had been sawing them by hand badly and slowly. Caleb leaned his bicycle against the wall, set his backpack under the tin roof and began, without waiting for permission to become formal. He placed each piece on the chopping block, checked for nails, split where grain allowed, tossed stove lengths into one pile and kindling into another. His rhythm was quiet. Lift, fall, crack, sort. The maul struck with a sound that entered Sadie's good ear cleanly and settled into the afternoon. After an hour she brought him water. He drank half the jar in one breath. "Thank you. I can pay some." "No, ma'am. You worked, my mother said. That is not wages." He shrugged, embarrassed now, and set the jar down carefully on the wall. She said, "If you tried, say about your grandfather." He meant hers. He meant Bernice's line, though the relations tangled in his mouth. Sadie did not correct him. Caleb came every Saturday after that if weather allowed. Sometimes he split wood, sometimes he carried debris to the alley for city pickup, sometimes he held boards while Sadie drove screws, or pushed stuck drawers from the other side, or stood on the courtyard wall to hand down walnut branches after Abel trimmed deadwood. He accepted coffee with too much milk and biscuits wrapped in napkins, but never money. When Sadie placed coins by his backpack one afternoon, he left them on the counter under the pearl buttons. By March, he had begun asking about tools. Not many questions. Good ones. What makes that ball not dent it worse? How you know where to push? Why that horn turn green? Sadie answered when she could. When she could not, she opened Miriam's notebook or Bernice's memory and found the beginning of an answer there. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning at 7:20, though the church where he preached stood 4 blocks in the other direction. He was a narrow man in his 70s with a black felt hat, polished shoes, and a coat brushed so carefully it might have been older than several of his parishioners. His church was called Mount Olive Missionary Baptist, a brick building with a white steeple and a bell that rang slightly flat. Sadie had seen him first from the courtyard while repairing the downspout. He passed the alley mouth, tipped his hat toward her, and continued without slowing. The next morning he did the same. By the 5th morning, Sadie lifted her hand in answer. He never came down the passage unless invited, and he was not invited for many weeks. His form of care stayed at a distance, hat raised, chin lowered, a pause just long enough to become deliberate. Once, during a hard rain, he stopped beneath an awning across the street and waited until Sadie looked up from fitting sash cord. Then he pressed his palms together and bowed his head. His prayer was 4 words long. "Lord," steady her hands. He said it quietly, not to draw attention from anyone else on the street, and not as if steady hands were a sentimental wish. They were, in his mouth, as necessary as bread. After that, whenever Sadie faced work requiring exact pressure, she heard the words without hearing them, scraping putty from old glass, packing mortar into heat-cracked joints, lifting a tape reel with cotton cloth, drawing the first dent from a school trumpet Caleb found at St. Agnes Thrift, and brought wrapped in a towel. Lord, steady her hands. One morning in late February, Reverend Boyd stopped at the alley mouth and called down to her as she carried plaster water to the courtyard. My sister had a cornet, he said. Sadie set the bucket down. She marched with it in '65. Would not let boys carry it for her. He smiled faintly. It is in my closet with a stuck valve. Sadie looked at the shop behind her, at the unfinished walls, at the counter not yet clean enough for customers, at the tools still being learned back into use. I am not open, she said. I did not ask if you were. He tipped his hat and walked on. The next day, a black cornet case appeared on the dry side of the courtyard door with a note tucked under the handle. No hurry. Sadie postponed the cellar until February 11th because some parts of a building announce themselves only after the rest has become less dangerous. The entrance was hidden under a trapdoor at the back of the workroom, half covered by a warped cabinet and 3 sacks of ruined plaster. She had noticed the iron ring weeks earlier, set flush into the floor, but had left it alone. There had been too many ways downward already, the stairs from the courtyard, the drain, the low places in the concrete, the private sinking that came when exhaustion asked whether any of this could matter. Another descent could wait. By mid-February, waiting had ended. She moved the cabinet with Caleb's help, both of them pushing from opposite sides while the swollen base screamed against concrete. Under it, the trapdoor showed itself fully, 2 planks cross-braced with iron, edges blackened by age, ring rusted but intact. Henry had sent a crowbar. Abel had sent advice through Henry, written on a torn receipt. Do not stand over what you open. Sadie tied a rope through the ring, stood to the side, and pulled. The door did not move. Caleb pulled with her. It lifted half an inch, exhaled cold air, then fell shut. They worked the edges with the crowbar, clearing grit and old paint, until the door finally came up with a groan so low it seemed to rise from beneath the street. A smell came with it. Stone, wet earth, old lime, and something mineral untouched by the mouldier air above. 7 granite steps led down. Each step was worn in the centre by feet long gone, the edges still sharp enough to show the hand that had dressed them. Sadie lowered the lantern first on a rope and watched its light settle below, small and gold against stone. Then she descended with one hand on the wall. The cellar was 12 feet by 15 feet, larger than she expected, built below the rear workroom with fieldstone walls and a floor of packed stone and brick. It was dry in the way deep places sometimes are dry, not from warmth but from having learned how to drain themselves before anyone living knew their names. Along one wall sat 3 empty shelves, oak planks on iron brackets. Along another lay broken crates, a ceramic jug with no handle, a coil of rope gone stiff, and 2 glass demijohns clouded white inside. At the centre of the floor was a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the rest. The surrounding floor was fieldstone, irregular, patched, practical. The slab was rectangular, about 3 feet by 2, set level and bordered by a narrow groove. In its upper surface, someone had carved a craft mark. A small bell crossed with a hammer, simple as a maker's stamp. Time had softened the edges but not erased the sign. Caleb crouched near it. You going to lift that? No. He looked disappointed and relieved together. Sadie did not touch the slab. The building had given enough at once before. A sealed bell. A notebook. A letter. Money. Tapes. Names. Not every hidden thing needed to be opened by the first hand that found it. Some doors were not refusal. They were timing. They cleaned the cellar instead. Rotten crates went up in pieces. Glass was wrapped before carrying. The shelves were brushed, then wiped with vinegar water. Sadie marked the height of the cellar walls in chalk and checked them after rain 2 days later. No new waterline appeared. That mattered. The deepest room might become the safest room for things that needed stable cool, though not yet for the master tapes. Those would wait for professional counsel and a place less unsafe. On the stairs going up, Caleb's boot struck something under the third step. A dull wooden knock answered. "Hold," Sadie said. She set the lantern on the second step and knelt. Beneath the third tread, tucked between stone and riser, was a narrow gap packed with dust. Something had been wedged there, just out of sight from below, protected by the lip of granite. Caleb handed her the dental pick from the tool roll. She eased away dirt, then slid 2 fingers into the gap and touched wood. A small oak box came free. It was no bigger than a Bible, darkened with age, its lid held by a simple brass clasp shaped like a leaf. The wood had remained dry. On top, scratched shallowly, was the same bell and hammer mark carved into the central slab. Sadie carried it upstairs before opening it, because the cellar felt too close to whatever vow had hidden it. At the workbench, with Caleb standing at a respectful distance and pretending not to lean forward, she lifted the clasp. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key was long, heavier than modern keys. It's bow-shaped not as a circle but as the same craft symbol, a bell crossed by a small hammer. Its bit was cut in 3 deep steps. It had been polished once, then wrapped in cloth, and still held a dull yellow gleam under age. Sadie turned it over. No label. No note. No lock came to mind. The tintype was wrapped in tissue that had browned at the folds. Sadie opened it on the blue cloth. A young woman stood in front of the shop's rear courtyard, though the walls behind her were cleaner, the blue tiles whole, the walnut tree no taller than a man. She wore a long dark skirt, a white shirtwaist, and an apron marked by work. In one hand she held a dent rod. In the other, a small brass bell section caught light so clearly that even the tintype's old surface seemed to brighten around it. The face stopped the room. Not identical. Time does not make copies with such laziness, but the brow, the mouth held in reserve, the set of the shoulders, the watchful angle of the head turned slightly to the right, as if favouring one ear over the other. Sadie looked at the photograph and felt no thrill, no fear, only a stillness. So complete Caleb whispered without meaning to, "She looks like you." Sadie turned the tintype over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words Celeste Bell, daughter of Laurent Bell, aged 25, summer of 1903. Not Miriam. Another woman between the named generations, or beside them. A daughter who had held a tool in the courtyard and looked toward the camera with Sadie's guarded face before any of the present griefs had been born. Sadie placed the photograph beside the folded letter, the key she carried to the mantel shelf above the stove, where it would not be lost among tools. There it sat for the rest of winter, brass bow catching firelight in the shape of the trade, opening nothing anyone yet understood. By March, the snow had retreated into gutters and memory, and New Orleans remembered its damp warmth by degrees. The creek beyond the canal ran loud with snowmelt from places north of the city, carrying brown water through culverts and under roads, past reeds newly green at their bases. Walnut catkins appeared on the tree behind the courtyard, hanging like soft green tassels from branches that had looked dead only weeks before. Weed flowers opened between bricks. Mosquitoes returned in exploratory numbers, not yet an army. The air began to smell of wet leaves, river mud and blossoms from yards Sadie could not see. Light entered differently after the windows. Morning reached the front counter. Afternoon touched the workbench. The office alcove held a warm square on the restored pine floor, where the ledger desk stood ready, though Sadie had no ledger yet except the notebook where debts, repairs, weather, names and measurements lived together. She cleaned the counter glass until the old display case became transparent enough to show the pearl buttons, mouthpiece brushes, valve pads, beeswax candles from Doris's requested batch, and one polished mouthpiece found in a drawer and restored, not for sale, but for witness. She did not begin the trade that spring. This decision came slowly and then all at once. There were horns waiting. Reverend Boyd's cornet sat in its black case beneath the bench, valve caps loosened but not yet addressed. Caleb had brought 2 school trumpets from St. Agnes Thrift, both dented and green at the slides. Henry had customers who would ask once word got around, though he pretended otherwise. Sadie had the tools, the manuals, Miriam's technical notes, Bernice's sentence, and hands steadier than they had been in December. Still, she waited. The shop had needed her first as a roof hand, mason, cleaner, carpenter, glazier, and keeper of dry paper. To enter the craft again only because a sign might one day hang outside felt too much like hurrying a note before breath had settled. Brass deserved better. So did the dead. She would order materials with 1 coin, not from the hidden wages or the carefully sealed bills, but from the ordinary coin found in the shop's own drawer and cleaned at the edge, small supplies only, cork sheet, felt, valve oil, a packet of springs, solder from a supplier Henry trusted. Then she would practice on scrap, small samples, broken tubing, bells beyond saving. She would draw dents where failure did not cost someone else's music. She would seat pads, lap valves, solder seams, undo them, and begin again. On April 9th, she filed the demolition delay with Mrs. Carver. The clerk read the attached photographs, the roof receipt, the chimney notes, the secured entry form, and the letter from Henry stating that remediation had begun. She stamped each page with the heavy brass seal and did not smile until the final sheet. "You made them wait, Mrs." Carver said. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Good. Governments need practice." Sadie returned to Rampart Street by bus, carrying the stamped delay in a folder against her chest. The city was warm enough now that open restaurant doors spilled music into the street. A trumpet somewhere played a melody too fast, then slowed as if corrected by an unseen teacher. Sadie walked past the front of the old club without entering, turned down the side passage, slipped through the gate, and stood a while under the walnut leaves. The brass key still sat on the mantel. The central cellar slab remained untouched. The tapes waited for a preservationist whose name she did not yet know. The money slept where it had been placed. Counted once, then left alone. The letter rested in its notebook beside the tools. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sadie completed the first repair she was willing to return under her own name. It was not a famous horn. It did not belong to a recording artist, a collector, a museum, or a man with money enough to mistake expense for care. It was Reverend Boyd's sister's cornet, the black case with 1 broken latch and a red velvet lining worn pale where the bell had rested for nearly 60 years. The instrument had marched in 1965, had played in church until breath and age parted company, then had slept in a closet through mildew seasons, funerals, roof repairs, grandchildren, and Sundays when no one remembered to open the case. The valves were frozen when Sadie first received it. The slides resisted. The bell had 2 dents near the rim and 1 crease along the flare. The water key cork had crumbled to dust. Old oil had hardened into a varnish dark as tea around the pistons. It would have been easy to overclean it, to polish away every trace of hand and weather, to make the cornet look newer than its own story. Sadie did not. She worked over 6 careful days, penetrating oil in drops, not floods, warm water baths, never boiling, valve casings cleaned with cloth and patience, pistons eased free by persuasion, not pliers, the dents drawn slowly with the smallest ball that answered the curve. The crease softened, not erased, new cork cut to fit the water key, felt pads seated flat, slides greased, springs replaced only where the old ones had lost their work entirely. When she finished, the cornet did not shine like a store window. It glowed in places where hands had held it most. The engraving remained shallow but legible. The bell rim kept one faint wave where metal had remembered impact and repair together. Sadie set it on the bench, lifted the mouthpiece, and played one note. Not loud. The note came out warm, centered, and a little worn at the edge, as if the horn had woken speaking in an older voice. Her damaged ear did not take all of it. Her right ear received enough. The rest entered through her hands, through the bench, through the floor she had repaired, through the room that had learned again how to hold sound. She placed the cornet in its case and wrote the ticket by hand. Cleaned. Valves freed. Pads replaced. Dints reduced. Slides working. Play gently for first week. Under price. She paused. Then she wrote, paid forward. The interior of Bell and Reed by then was still modest, but it no longer looked abandoned. The front counter had been sanded, repaired, and sealed with oil, so the grain showed beneath the glass like dark water. The display case held valve pads sorted by thickness, cork sheet, beeswax candles, cleaned mouthpieces, felt rings, and handwritten cards explaining what could be repaired and what should not be forced. Behind the counter, the office alcove held a ledger, a chair from St. Agnes Thrift, and a lamp with a green shade that Henry rewired under protest, insisting he was not an electrician while completing the work correctly. The workroom had become orderly without becoming sterile. Dent rods hung from the pegboard according to size. Burnishes lay in a narrow drawer lined with felt. The old vise had been cleaned and oiled, its jaws refaced with leather. Miriam's tools hung apart from the everyday tools, not as museum pieces, but as elders whose use required clean hands. The opened sousaphone no longer hung above the bench. Sadie had lowered it with Abel, Caleb, Henry, and 2 ropes, then rested it on a wall cradle where its repaired bell faced the room. The cedar disc sat beside it, labelled only with a date. The tapes had been moved to a climate-controlled archive after months of letters, cautious phone calls, and one visit from a preservation specialist out of Baton Rouge who wore cotton gloves and spoke to the reels more respectfully than most people speak to the living. No one had sold them. No one had played them on a common machine. Digital transfers existed now in 2 safe places, with names attached where names could be known, and blanks left blank, where guessing would have been vanity. The medal had been cleaned only with a dry cloth. The brass key remained on the mantel until the second winter's first hard rain, when the walnut tree gave up its secret. A storm moved through on December 17th, all-night wind and low thunder, hard enough to send branches knocking against the rear wall. Sadie woke before dawn to a crack so loud she sat upright behind the counter, though she had not slept there regularly for more than a year. By then she had a narrow cot in the office alcove and a wool blanket from Doris, but storms still sometimes brought her back to the front room, where she could hear the door and the drain. At first light she went into the courtyard. A large branch had broken from the walnut, not the one with the horseshoe, but a lower limb that had been hollowed at the base. It had fallen against the wall and split lengthwise, revealing dark heartwood and the work of insects. Sadie cut away smaller branches with Abel's old pruning saw, then looked up at the trunk to judge the damage. That was when she saw the brass plate. It had been hidden behind bark grown over its edges. Just below and to the right of the old horseshoe, covered for decades by a flap of living wood that the storm had torn loose. The plate was no wider than her palm, green with age, set into the trunk with 4 small screws almost swallowed by bark. At its centre was a keyhole. Sadie went inside without hurrying. The key from the oak box had been on the mantel so long it had become part of the room's outline. She took it down, wiped dust from the bit, and returned to the tree. Rainwater still dripped from the branches. The horseshoe held its small bright curve. She climbed the brick step she had used years before, steadied herself with one hand against the trunk, and set the key into the plate. It fit. The turn was stiff, then smooth. A narrow door opened inward, not into the whole tree, but into a small brass-lined cavity built before bark had closed around it. Inside was a packet wrapped in oilcloth, dry as if the storm had happened somewhere else. Sadie lifted it out and carried it to the workbench before unwrapping it. Within lay a folded 48-star American flag, small, not a burial flag, but hand-sewn or cut down from a larger one. Its stars yellowed and its red stripes darkened toward brown. Beneath it was a note written in a hand she had seen only on the back of the tintype. August 14th, 1918, for whoever keeps the bench after us. My brother Josiah has gone across the ocean, and Mama says no tree should be asked to hold sorrow without also holding proof that we loved the one who left. I have placed this flag here because hiding is sometimes the only keeping women are allowed. If he comes home, we will laugh at my caution and he can take it out himself. If he does not, let the tree remember what the house could not say aloud. The key is made in our mark. Do not sell it. Do not polish the grief off it. Celeste Bell. Sadie read the date again. August 14th, 1918. 3 months before the armistice. Before the telegram. Before Miriam would write, decades later, that her brother had been lost in France. Before grief had become a line in a letter. Here it was still waiting, still conditional, still holding open the possibility of return. She folded the note along its creases and placed it beside the 48-star flag. The tree had kept a sister's fear longer than any person had been alive to explain it. The brass plate, the key, the carved mark, the tintype, the central slab below, all belonged to a family that had hidden not treasure first, but remembrance. Sadie left the flag unfolded only long enough to inspect for insects and damp. Then she wrapped it again and stored it in an archival box the preservationist had sent after she wrote to ask what one should do with cloth found inside a tree. That spring, on May 27th, 2024, Memorial Day, Sadie carried Elias Bell's medal to Chalmette National Cemetery. She did not carry it alone. Reverend Boyd came in his brushed coat, Caleb came on his Schwinn, though he was taller now, and the bicycle looked smaller beneath him. Henry drove because he said ceremonies should not rely on parish buses. Doris sent biscuits wrapped in wax paper and did not attend, saying somebody had to keep coffee ready for the living. At the cemetery, rows of white stones stood in sunlight near the old battlefield ground, each marker holding a name, date, and silence given public shape. Elias was not buried there. Josiah was not buried there. Many men never returned to the soil that first knew their footsteps. Sadie understood that more clearly after holding their objects than she might have from any plaque. She placed the medal in her palm, not on the ground, and stood beneath an oak while Reverend Boyd said another short prayer, longer than 4 words this time, but still careful not to claim knowledge he did not have. No band played. No official spoke. A groundskeeper passed at a distance on a mower and lifted his hand. Sadie lifted hers back. Then she wrapped the medal again and brought it home, where it rested in a case beneath the letter, not hidden now, but not displayed for curiosity either. The money remained almost entirely untouched. This was not because Sadie had no need. Need had become familiar enough to sit at her table without introduction. The roof had cost, the chimney had cost, glass, putty, lime, locks, oil, archival boxes, postage, preservation consultation, bus fares, tool repair, stovepipe, all of it drew from somewhere, but she had made a rule after reading the letter, and the rule held because it was simple. Use ordinary earnings first. Use credit only when a name and date can be written honestly. Use the hidden cash only when the work itself would otherwise fail, or a living body would be made unsafe. In 2 winters, she spent 3 coins and 2 fragile bills. 1 coin helped order the first cork and felt when the shop had no other income. 1 paid for archival shipping when the preservationist said delay would risk damage. 1 bought a lockbox bolted above the floodline after Henry refused to accept more credit and called the purchase sense, not luxury. The 2 bills paid the emergency doctor when an infected cut in Sadie's thumb began sending red lines up her hand, and Doris stood in the doorway until Sadie agreed to go. The rest was sealed again. Not in the sousaphone. That hiding place had completed its service. Sadie placed the remaining envelopes, coins, ledger page, Celeste's note copy, and a written account of every use inside a new fireproof box set in the cellar on the shelf above the high water mark. Beside it, she placed a paper that read, "For the next one, if need is honest." She did not know who the next one would be. That was not hers to decide. The shop reopened without announcement. No painted banner. No newspaper feature. No ribbon. No photographer asking her to stand in the doorway with a horn raised like proof of triumph. Sadie was wary of attention that arrived hungry. The city had enough mouths already. The first notice appeared on the corkboard at Delphine's cafe, pinned between a flyer for piano lessons and a card advertising lawn care. Bell Reed Brass Repair. Small brass instruments only. Cleaning. Valve work. Minor dent work. No rush jobs. Ask at cafe or leave note in blue box. The index card was written in Sadie's hand. Doris complained that the letters were too modest and traced over them with a black marker, while Sadie drank coffee at the counter and said nothing. Henry placed a second card near his register. Reverend Boyd mentioned the shop after service only by saying, "Some horns can be helped again." Caleb told 3 band students at his school, then insisted he had told only 1. Within 6 months, there were 43 names on a mailing list. Sadie kept in the ledger. Not customers in the modern sense. Names, instruments, schools, churches, players, people with cornet cases under beds. Trumpets dropped in parades, flugelhorns inherited from uncles, mouthpieces stuck after a season in a closet, valves slow from neglect rather than ruin. Sadie wrote each name carefully. She accepted fewer jobs than people wanted. She returned some with apologies and recommendations. She learned to say no before damage made refusal crueler. Her work travelled quietly. A repaired trumpet played in a school gym where the air conditioning failed during the spring concert. Reverend Boyd's sister's cornet played 3 hymns at Mount Olive, held by a niece who had never met the woman who marched with it. A battered marching baritone from St. Augustine made it through an entire parade without its 3rd valve sticking. A widow from Gentilly brought a horn, still smelling faintly of her husband's closet, and left with the case held closer against her chest, though the repair had been simple. Sadie made receipts. She paid Henry monthly. She delivered candles to Doris, who sold them by the register, and told customers they were for people with sense enough not to buy perfume that made soup taste like soap. Abel came less often as his knee worsened, but when he did, he inspected repairs he did not understand and found small faults anyway. That shelf leans, it holds. So does a drunk until he does not. She fixed the shelf. Caleb returned with the sign in late October, carrying it under one arm and trying to appear casual. He was 18 by then, taller, quieter, with work in his shoulders and fine sawdust caught in his hair. He had traded the Schwinn for a used pickup that coughed before starting, but he still leaned the old bicycle in the courtyard sometimes, as if unwilling to let a faithful thing vanish just because another had become necessary. He had been working afternoons with a cabinet maker in mid-city, sweeping floors at first, then sanding, then cutting simple joints under supervision. The sign was wrapped in a quilt. Sadie was polishing a mouthpiece when he laid it on the counter. "Not fancy," he said before she touched the cloth. "That is usually best. I did the letters twice. First time looked foolish. Letters often do." He unwrapped it. The board was cypress, salvaged from a storm-damaged porch, planned smooth but left with its grain alive. He had carved the words by hand, not routed, each letter carrying the slight variation of a human wrist. At the top was the small bell and hammer mark copied from the key. Beneath it, Bell Reed, Brass Repair, Daughters. Sadie read the last line once. Then again. Plural. Caleb looked at the floor. Doris said it should not just be sons. Henry said, "Don't ask him. He sells chicken feed." Reverend said names can bless backward and forward. "I just carved it." The shop was very still. Sadie ran one finger along the carved ampersand where Caleb had rounded the edge so rain would not sit in the cut. There had been daughters all along, Miriam, Celeste, Bernice by craft if not by blood, Sadie herself, the unnamed ones whose hands had held tools in rooms where men answered the front questions. A plural did not make a parade, it corrected the door. "It is good," she said. Caleb breathed out through his nose. Good enough to hang. Yes, they hung it the following Saturday over the basement entrance, not on the old club's grand front, but in the rear courtyard above the green door that had once swollen shut. Henry held the ladder and complained about the angle. Abel sat in a chair and complained about Henry. Doris arrived with coffee and said the sign made the alley look less criminal. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat before the first screw was driven. Sadie stood back when it was done. The sign did not make the shop famous. It made it findable. That was enough. In the second winter, after the cornet was finished, and the sign had survived its first storm, Sadie began writing her own letter. She did it at the desk in the office alcove, on paper heavy enough to endure folding. The green-shaded lamp cast a round pool of light over the oiled pine floor. The stove ticked in the workroom outside. Rain gathered in the horseshoe's curve. The brass key rested again on the mantel, because some objects belong where hands can see them, and remember to ask better questions. She did not know who she was writing to. That made the words more honest. She had considered beginning with explanation, dates, repairs, warnings where the money rested, who held the copies of the recordings which stepped to avoid when the courtyard flooded, how to mix lime plaster, which supplier still sold decent valve felt, how to tell Henry's son from Henry because both would answer the store phone the same way. But before facts came welcome, Miriam had known that. Sadie dipped the pen, though a ballpoint would have been easier. Some gestures are not about efficiency. She wrote, "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped. Not because words failed, but because the room filled around the sentence. It held the first night's darkness, the peppermints, the stove's first drawer, the cedar smell from the sousaphone, the long letter unfolded under morning light, the plaster pressed into lath, the heron standing in grey water, Caleb's maul striking wood, Doris's jars, Henry's legal pad, Reverend Boyd's foreword prayer, Mrs. Carver's stamp, Bernice's pencil, Earl's cornet, Miriam's hand, Celeste's hidden flag, Elias's medal, and the hundreds of small silences that had not been empty after all. Even silence can keep a song, Sadie continued. She wrote about floodlines and rooflines. She wrote about not trusting mould hidden behind beauty. She wrote that old recordings must never be played on common equipment. She wrote that a dent should be approached from the edge of its memory, not its loudest wound. She wrote the names of those who had helped and what they had given, because a person inheriting a place should inherit obligations as well as shelter. She wrote that money kept too long can become fear, and money spent too quickly can become vanity, so the hand must be steadier than either. She wrote until the stove burned low. At the end, she did not copy Miriam's final lines. That would have been theft, not tribute. Instead she wrote what the room had taught in its own weathered language. This shop is not yours because you possess it. It is yours while you keep it alive. She signed with her full name and the date. Then she placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and stored it in the fireproof box beside the account ledger, not hidden so deeply it would become a cruelty, not displayed so plainly that the careless would find it first. The brass horn repair shop waits. It has always waited. Above it, the old Magnolia Crescent Club remains closed, though no longer entirely doomed. Its upper rooms still hold dust, broken plaster, fallen music stands, and a dance floor warped by years of heat. Sadie does not hurry that part. Some buildings return by floors, some lives do too. The city has extended the demolition delay twice, then changed the file from immediate removal to conditional stabilization. Mrs. Carver marked the update in red pencil, stamped the page, and lifted one eyebrow as if daring any office to object. in her desk drawer. Under the tray, the $1 bill remains. Sadie saw it there once when she brought in the second extension papers. The drawer opened. The tray shifted. There was the bill, worn and folded, lying flat beneath paper clips and a spare stamp pad. Mrs. Carver did not mention it. Sadie did not mention it either. Some records are official. Some are kept because one person recognized a name, a need, and a door that might still open.